After years of caring for my son and his family, I never expected this. One day he looked at me coldly and said, "Pack your bags or go to a nursing home." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but instead of feeling defeated, I felt a strange sense of freedom. Without hesitation, I grabbed my duffel bag, flashed him a smile, and walked out the door. I did not need his approval or anyone else's. I was taking control of my own life, and nothing would stand in my way. My name is Martin. I am 69 years old, and what I am about to tell you will forever change how you view family loyalty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth. We were sitting at the polished oak dining table in the sprawling suburban house I had supposedly been a guest in for the past 4 years. The aroma of roast chicken filled the room, providing a deceptive comfort that masked the bitter tension brewing for months. I was quietly eating my meal, minding my own business, when Megan, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, abruptly stopped cutting her food. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out 3 glossy pamphlets, and tossed them forcefully across the table. They slid across the polished wood and came to a stop right next to my dinner plate. I looked down. The covers featured overly cheerful elderly people sitting in wheelchairs playing bingo in sterile fluorescent-lit rooms. State-funded senior care, one read. Affordable assisted living, proclaimed another. I looked up from the pamphlets and stared directly at Megan. She was perfectly manicured, wearing a cashmere sweater, and staring back at me with a cold, calculating entitlement she barely bothered to hide anymore. Her pale blue eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "We have been doing some research, Martin," she said, her voice dripping with a completely fabricated concern. "It is time for you to start looking at more appropriate living arrangements. You need to be around people your own age. We found some places that accept basic state pensions." I slowly placed my fork down, letting the heavy silence stretch across the dining room. I turned my gaze to Xavier, my son. The boy I had raised with every ounce of my strength, teaching him the value of hard work, integrity, and respect. Now at 36 years old, he sat across from me in a tailored suit, avoiding my eyes. He swirled his expensive red wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip before finally speaking. "Megan is right, Dad," Xavier said, his tone incredibly dismissive. "You have been living in our guest suite for 4 years. We needed you when my startup was struggling, and having you watch Leo saved us a fortune in nanny fees. But Leo is in kindergarten full-time now. Things are different. We are at a different stage in our lives." I looked at him, feeling a deep, hollow ache in my chest. "A different stage?" I asked quietly. "Yes." Xavier snapped, his arrogance flaring up to mask his obvious guilt. "We need our space. You are barely scraping by on that meager retirement check. You do not contribute anything financially to this household. It is a burden on us, Dad. We cannot keep subsidizing your life." The audacity of his words was staggering. Subsidizing my life. He actually believed his own lies. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. "Subsidizing my life," I repeated. "Xavier, do you remember when you were 25, you maxed out 3 credit cards trying to fund a lifestyle you could not afford to impress your friends? The debt collectors were calling your office. You were going to be sued." He stiffened in his chair, his jaw clenching. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "I sold my restored classic car." I continued, making sure every word landed heavily. "The car I spent 5 years rebuilding with my own hands. I sold it for cash and handed you a check for $20,000 so you would not ruin your life before it even started. Did you consider me a financial burden then?" Megan rolled her eyes, letting out a loud theatrical sigh that echoed in the quiet room. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Are you really bringing up ancient history? You gave your son some money a decade ago. That is what parents are supposed to do. You cannot use that to hold us hostage in our own home forever. Your little pension does not pay the mortgage here, Martin. We are the ones carrying the weight. Your presence here is dragging us down." "Speaking of this home," Megan continued, leaning forward, her voice turning sharp and unmistakably authoritative. "My parents are flying in from Boston tomorrow. They are going to be staying with us for the next 2 months. My father just sold his firm, and they want to spend quality time with their grandson." I looked at her, putting the pieces of her cruel puzzle together. "And they need the guest suite," I stated. Exactly, Megan replied, flashing a tight, triumphant smile. My parents are used to a very specific standard of living. I am not putting them up in a cramped hotel when we have a perfectly good, spacious suite right here. I need that room empty, cleaned and aired out by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. She reached over and tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the cheap nursing home brochures resting by my plate. I took the liberty of calling the first place on that pile. They have an available bed in a shared room. It is fully covered by your basic pension. You can pack your things tonight and Xavier will drive you over there first thing in the morning before my parents arrive from the airport. I looked at Xavier. He was staring intensely at his plate, absolutely refusing to intervene, as his wife ordered his father out of the house like a piece of broken, unwanted furniture. He had completely sold his soul to this superficial, materialistic life. He saw me exactly as she did, a useless old man taking up valuable real estate. They truly believed I was entirely dependent on their mercy. They truly believed they held all the power. A lesser man might have shouted in anger. A weaker father might have cried, begging for a few more weeks, pleading to stay close to his grandson. But I did not feel sorrow. As I looked at their smug, expectant faces, all I felt was a profound, icy clarity. The mask I had worn for 4 long years was finally ready to come off. I picked up my cloth napkin, gently dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I picked up my knife and fork and finished the last piece of chicken on my plate, chewing slowly and deliberately. The silence in the dining room became suffocating for them, but for me it was glorious. Megan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of reaction. Xavier finally looked up, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up to my full height. I walked out of the dining room and down the hall to the guest suite. I did not need the entire night to pack. I had seen this betrayal coming for months. I reached into the closet and pulled out the canvas duffel bag I had quietly packed 3 days ago. It contained my clothes, my toiletries, and a small metal lockbox holding financial documents they knew absolutely nothing about. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, grabbed my coat, and walked back out to the brightly lit foyer. Xavier and Megan had come out to the hallway, watching me with a mixture of shock and arrogant satisfaction. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the trash. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy set of brass keys to the house. I tossed them through the air. They landed on the glass console table with a loud final clatter. I looked at Xavier, then at Megan, and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I hope you two can pay this month's bills on your own, I said, my voice steady and cold. I turned around, walked out into the cool evening air, and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, and I did not even make it down the driveway before I heard Megan squeal with delight. It was a high, piercing sound of absolute victory that cut through the cool night air. Through the sheer curtains of the front window, I could clearly see her literally jumping into Xavier's arms. He hugged her back, visibly relieved that the supposed financial burden had finally been lifted from their shoulders. They did not waste a single second grieving my departure or worrying about where a 69-year-old man might sleep that night. Before my private car even pulled up to the curb, Megan was already on her cell phone, aggressively pacing the brightly lit foyer. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was calling the premium overnight contracting crew she had bookmarked months ago. She was ordering them to come in at dawn to rip out my old carpet, tear down my bookshelves, and paint over the walls. She wanted every single trace of my existence eradicated before her wealthy parents arrived from Boston. She probably thought I was sitting at a bus stop, shivering in the cold, crying into my hands, and wondering how I would survive the night in some dreary, state-funded facility. The harsh reality, however, was about to hit them like a runaway freight train. My driver did not take me to a nursing home. We drove right past the dreary suburbs, merging onto the highway that led straight into the glittering, expensive heart of the city. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the Monarch Tower, a luxury residential building where the monthly maintenance fee alone cost more than Xavier earned in half a year. The concierge, a young man in a crisp, tailored suit, rushed forward to open my door. He greeted me respectfully by name, bowing slightly as I passed. I took the private elevator straight up to the penthouse suite I had maintained in absolute secret for the last decade. The steel doors opened directly into a sprawling living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire downtown skyline. I dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the custom Italian leather sofa and walked over to the wet bar to pour myself a glass of neat top-shelf bourbon. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Bradley picked up on the second ring. He was my private wealth attorney, a ruthless 50-year-old bulldog of a man who specialized in high-net-worth family disputes and corporate asset protection. He had been begging me to stop funding Xavier's massive illusion of success for years. I took a slow sip of the burning liquid and looked out at the city lights. "Bradley," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "The charity ends tonight. Cut off the lifeblood. Activate Clause 4 of the family trust immediately." I could hear the sheer satisfaction radiating through Bradley's voice. "Consider it done, Martin. I will freeze every single account within the hour." For 4 long years, Xavier and Megan genuinely believed I was a broke retiree, surviving on a tiny government check. They thought they were being gracious by letting me sleep in their guest suite to watch my grandson. They never knew that the tech startup Xavier constantly boasted about was secretly funded by an anonymous angel investor group that I wholly owned and controlled. They never knew that I had built a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio over 40 years of grueling, calculated investments. I chose to live simply because I wanted my son to build his own empire. I wanted him to earn his place in the harsh world. Instead, he used my quiet presence as a prop to boost his own fragile ego, treating me like a worthless dependent while silently draining my resources to fund his flashy lifestyle. I wanted to protect them from the corruption of unearned wealth, but my protection had only bred extreme toxic entitlement. Now the brutal lesson was going to begin. The very next morning, Megan was determined to solidify her triumph. She met 2 of her equally pretentious friends at an exclusive boutique furniture showroom downtown. She needed to purchase a pristine vanity set, imported Egyptian cotton sheets, and a hand-carved mahogany headboard for the newly emptied guest suite. She paraded through the aisles, pointing at exorbitant items and loudly bragging to her friends about how she had finally reclaimed her house from her freeloading father-in-law. She wanted her parents to step into a room that screamed old money. When she arrived at the register, her total came to just over $9,000. She did not even blink. She reached into her designer purse with a smug, self-satisfied smile and handed the cashier her sleek, heavy platinum credit card. The cashier swiped it. A sharp, loud beep echoed from the machine. The young woman frowned, tapped the screen, and swiped it again. Another error beep rang out. Megan scoffed, glaring at the cashier. "Run it again," she demanded, her voice laced with extreme irritation and condescension. "Your machine must be broken." "Do you have any idea who I am?" The cashier awkwardly inserted the chip. The screen flashed bright red. "I am sorry, ma'am," the cashier whispered, casting a nervous glance at Megan's friends, who were now watching the entire scene very closely. "The card has been declined. The bank says the account is frozen." Megan turned completely crimson. Her friends exchanged a silent, highly judgmental look. "That is absolutely impossible!" Megan shrieked, snatching the card back aggressively. She quickly pulled out a second premium card from her wallet and slapped it onto the glass counter. "Try this one." The cashier obliged. Another sharp beep filled the quiet store. "Declined." Megan stood completely frozen, utterly humiliated in front of the very women she constantly tried to impress. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the store, leaving her lavish purchases sitting on the counter. I was sitting on my penthouse balcony enjoying a hot cup of premium coffee when my phone vibrated violently against the glass table. The caller ID flashed Xavier's name. I let it ring 3 times before finally answering, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a single word. Xavier did not even wait for a greeting. His voice came through the speaker, breathless, panicked, and absolutely furious. "Dad, what the hell did you do?" he screamed into the receiver. "Megan is stranded at a furniture store. The cashier completely humiliated her in front of her friends. The bank just sent me an automated text saying the platinum cards are locked due to unauthorized user status. Call the customer service line right now and tell them to unlock our auxiliary cards. You have absolutely no right to mess with our daily finances just because you threw a tantrum and left last night. Fix this immediately." He was breathing heavily, fully expecting me to cower, apologize, and obediently call the bank to restore their access. He genuinely thought that because his name was printed on the shiny plastic, the money belonged to him. He thought I was just a senile guarantor for their lavish lifestyle, a convenient signature they could use and abuse. He had grown so incredibly accustomed to the invisible financial safety net I provided that he mistook my wealth for his own personal hammock. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. I listened to his heavy, frantic breathing through the receiver, letting his panic hang in the air. "Xavier," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or warmth. "You seem to be under a massive, pathetic delusion. I did not lock your auxiliary cards. Those are my primary accounts. You and your wife have merely been authorized users for the past 4 years. I removed your names from my portfolio at 8 o'clock this morning. If you want to buy imported Egyptian cotton sheets, I suggest you use your own money." The dead, horrified silence on his end was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. I pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. The sting of public humiliation is a powerful motivator for a narcissist. Megan did not return home to reflect on her actions. Instead, she weaponized her extreme embarrassment. Less than an hour after her premium credit cards were declined at the furniture store, she took to social media to spin a malicious web of lies. A massive tear-stained paragraph appeared on her Facebook page tagging Xavier and dozens of our extended family members. In her fabricated narrative, she played the role of a desperate, heartbroken daughter-in-law. She claimed that my mental health had been rapidly deteriorating for months and that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. She wrote that I had experienced a terrifying episode of dementia, stolen a large sum of emergency cash from her bedroom drawer, and wandered out into the dangerous city streets in the dead of night. She begged her followers for prayers and shared a ridiculously outdated photo of me looking frail and confused. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a saintly caretaker whose safe home had been violated by a confused, ungrateful old man. It was a calculated strike designed to destroy my reputation entirely. The digital wildfire spread exactly as she intended. Within minutes, my phone began to light up with a relentless barrage of notifications. Distant cousins, overly concerned aunts and nephews I had not spoken to in years, flooded my inbox with frantic messages and angry voicemails. They scolded me for being so reckless and demanded to know how I could betray the saintly couple who had so graciously taken me in. One particularly loud voicemail from Xavier's aunt accused me of being an ungrateful burden who was tearing a young family apart and causing unnecessary trauma. She threatened to call the police herself if I did not return the supposed stolen funds immediately. The absolute hypocrisy of my extended family would have infuriated me a few days ago. They were the same people who never once called to check on my actual well-being, yet they were quick to judge based on a single social media post. But sitting in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, I felt nothing but a profound, undisturbed peace. I poured myself a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea, the steam rising softly in the cool, air-conditioned air of the spacious living room. I sat back in my plush armchair and watched the screen of my smartphone light up over and over again. I did not answer a single call. I did not type out a frantic defensive reply to Megan's post to clear my name. Engaging in a public shouting match with a manipulative liar is a fool's errand. I let them spin their false narrative, allowing Megan to dig her own grave deeper with every sympathetic comment she liked and replied to. She was providing me with perfectly documented evidence of defamation. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I opened my messaging app and forwarded a screenshot of Megan's post directly to Bradley. I attached a single sentence to the image: "It is time to drop the hammer." I set the phone face down on the glass table and turned my attention to the breathtaking view of the city skyline. Across town, Xavier was sitting at the head of a sleek glass conference table in his startup office. He was desperately trying to project the image of a successful tech chief executive to his anxious development team, barking orders and pretending the sudden freezing of his personal accounts was just a minor banking error. He assured his staff that payroll would not be affected, relying on his usual arrogant charm to mask the rising panic in his chest. His fragile facade of authority was brutally shattered when the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open violently. Bradley walked in. My lawyer did not bother stopping at the reception desk, and he certainly did not ask for permission to interrupt the crucial meeting. Dressed in a flawless, charcoal gray tailored suit and carrying a premium leather briefcase, Bradley radiated an aura of absolute terrifying authority. The entire room fell dead silent. The developers stared in shock, sensing the immediate shift in the room's power dynamic. Xavier stood up, his face flushing with a mix of fierce indignation and sudden fear. He opened his mouth to demand who this intruder was and threatened to call building security, but Bradley did not give him the chance to speak a single word. Without uttering any polite greeting, Bradley marched directly to the head of the table and slammed a thick, imposing legal folder down right in front of Xavier. The loud smack of leather against glass made several employees physically jump in their seats. "I represent Martin Bradley," announced his voice, slicing through the tense room like a freshly sharpened blade. "And you, Xavier, are currently in violation of multiple civil statutes. Consider this your formal warning." Bradley tapped the thick folder with his index finger, keeping his piercing gaze locked on my son. "Inside this file is a formal cease and desist order drafted against your wife for malicious defamation and libel. Attached to that order is a comprehensive certified financial statement spanning the last 4 years. It documents every single dollar my client has funneled into your personal bank accounts, your mortgage payments, your luxury vehicle leases, and the very startup you are currently sitting in. It proves unequivocally that Martin has been financially supporting your entire existence, completely destroying your wife's fabricated narrative of a desperate, thieving old man." Bradley leaned in closer, placing both hands on the glass table, and dropped his voice to a low, menacing register that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "You have exactly 2 hours to ensure that ridiculous Facebook post is permanently deleted from the internet. If it is still online at 1 minute past 2 o'clock, I will file a defamation lawsuit so massive it will ensure you and your wife spend the rest of your miserable lives paying off the legal fees. I will publicly expose your entire financial reality, detailing exactly how you have survived on your father's charity to every single person in your social circle and all your professional investors." Xavier practically knocked his office chair over, scrambling for his cell phone. Within 10 minutes, Megan's tearful, fraudulent post completely vanished from the internet. But the true devastation was only just beginning. With a trembling hand, Xavier opened the thick folder Bradley had left behind. He flipped past the cease and desist order and stared blankly at the certified financial statements. His eyes scanned the detailed breakdown of his monthly mortgage payments. His breath hitched, and his entire body went completely rigid. He flipped to the attached property deed summary. The name listed as the primary owner of the sprawling suburban mansion they lived in was not his. It was a corporate entity completely controlled by me. Xavier practically sprinted out of the glass doors of his tech startup, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The thick legal folder Bradley had left behind felt like a burning coal in his hands. He ignored his employees' confused stares, jumped into his luxury sedan, and drove recklessly toward the downtown branch of his primary bank. His mind raced desperately, trying to construct a logical explanation for what he had just read. He had signed the closing papers 4 years ago. He was the homeowner. He was the man who built the extravagant life Megan constantly showed off to her wealthy parents. But the lingering icy dread in his stomach told a very different story. He burst through the heavy brass doors of the bank, his face flushed and covered in a cold sweat. He marched directly to the front desk, completely bypassing the line of waiting customers, and demanded to see a senior mortgage specialist immediately. The polished illusion of his self-made success was rapidly cracking, and he needed to see the original property deeds right now. He needed someone to look him in the eye and confirm that his father was bluffing. The senior branch manager ushered an erratic Xavier into a private glass office. He typed Xavier's credentials into the system and pulled up the master file for the suburban property. Xavier sat on the edge of his seat, demanding to see the absolute proof of his ownership. The manager adjusted his glasses, looking at the computer screen with a practiced, neutral expression. He turned the monitor so Xavier could see the dense legal text. "You are merely the nominal title holder," the manager explained slowly, "but the property is subject to a massive primary lien. Your 20% down payment did not come from a standard bank grant or a personal cash gift. It was wired directly from a private commercial lending entity known as Apex Holdings, LLC. Xavier stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the information. He had never heard of Apex Holdings in his entire life. He never knew the actual truth about my career. When I supposedly retired from a mediocre administrative job decades ago, I had actually been aggressively acquiring commercial and residential real estate across the state. I built an entire highly lucrative empire completely under the radar. Apex Holdings LLC was just one of many corporate shields I created to protect my massive asset portfolio. I specifically set up this exact LLC to finance Xavier's house as a final ultimate test of my son's character. If Xavier proved to be a responsible, respectful man, the LLC would legally forgive the entire loan upon my passing, leaving him with a fully paid-off estate. Instead, he proved to be an arrogant, entitled fool who did not even bother reading the fine print of his own mortgage closing documents when he was blinded by the prospect of living in a mansion. The bank manager pulled a physical copy of the original contract from a secure filing cabinet and slid it across the mahogany desk. He pointed a manicured finger directly to the bottom of the final page, right at the signature of the LLC's managing director. Xavier stared at my distinctive signature, the ink spelling out his father's name, and felt all the blood drain from his face. While Xavier was still staring in absolute horror at the undeniable proof of my ownership, his smartphone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was an automated email alert from the mortgage servicing portal, followed immediately by a highly certified encrypted digital letter directly from Apex Holdings LLC. Xavier opened the attachment with shaking fingers. The bold red header at the top of the document read, "Formal Notice of Default and Rate Adjustment." The legal jargon filling the page was incredibly dense, but the bottom line was brutally unavoidably clear. The original loan agreement Xavier had so hastily signed contained a strict occupancy and financial guarantor clause. Because Xavier lacked the credit history and the actual income to secure such a massive loan on his own 4 years ago, I had signed on as the primary financial guarantor. The highly favorable fixed interest rate he had been enjoying was entirely contingent upon the guarantor maintaining permanent residency at the property. By aggressively forcing me to pack my bags and vacate the premises, Xavier had fundamentally breached the core covenant of the mortgage contract. He had evicted his own financial shield. The penalty outlined in the contract was immediate and completely unforgiving. The protective fixed rate was entirely dissolved instantly, triggering a punitive variable rate designed for high-risk commercial defaults. The notice explicitly stated that the sudden removal of the primary guarantor classified the entire loan as a distressed asset. Every single safety net Xavier thought he possessed was legally vaporized by his own arrogant command to kick me out of my room. He was holding a financial grenade that he had personally stripped of its pin, and the detonation was inescapable. Xavier scrolled down with trembling thumbs to view the revised payment schedule. His stomach violently dropped as if he had just stepped off a ledge. The monthly mortgage payment, which used to be a very manageable $4,000, had instantly skyrocketed to an astronomical $12,000. The new billing cycle was set to begin in exactly 14 days. He had absolutely no way to pay it. His startup accounts were completely frozen, and Megan's credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. He drove back to the house in a state of absolute paralyzing shock. He walked through the grand front door and found Megan standing in the foyer, loudly complaining into her phone about the interior decorators who had just canceled on her due to payment failures. Xavier completely exploded. He snatched the phone out of her hand, threw it onto the sofa, and shoved the printed bank documents directly into her chest. A massive screaming fight broke out instantly. Xavier viciously blamed Megan for pushing his father out and ruining their lives. Megan screamed back, her face red with fury, calling Xavier a pathetic fraud who lied about his wealth and secretly relied on his daddy's money to look like a successful man. The vicious echoes of their argument bounced off the freshly stripped walls of the empty guest suite. They were completely broke, turning on each other like starved animals trapped in a cage. The perfect marriage they constantly displayed to the world was crumbling under the weight of a single, undeniable financial truth. Without my money, they were absolutely nothing. The screaming match finally burned out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the massive house. Megan paced the living room, her eyes darting around the expensive furniture they could no longer afford. Her sheer panic slowly morphed into a toxic, desperate calculation. She stopped pacing and looked at Xavier with a wild, manic gleam in her eyes. "We just sell it," she declared, her voice trembling with misplaced confidence. "The housing market is at an all-time high right now. We put this house on the market tomorrow, sell it for a massive profit, pay off your father's stupid LLC, and take the remaining equity to start over somewhere else." It was a reckless, impulsive plan, born out of pure desperation, completely ignoring the massive legal trap that was already closing tightly around them. Megan's reckless plan to sell the house hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall within 48 hours. Driven by absolute panic, she had immediately contacted a high-end real estate agent aggressively pushing for a rapid off-market sale. The housing market was indeed scorching hot, and they miraculously secured a cash buyer willing to close in 10 days. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Megan and Xavier thought they had outsmarted me. They started calculating their imaginary profits, convinced they were about to walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity. But the illusion shattered the moment the title company initiated the escrow process. The closing agent sent an urgent flagged email to Xavier outlining a catastrophic roadblock. The property transfer could not legally proceed without a formal release of lien from the primary lien holder Apex Holdings LLC. They needed my signature. They needed the explicit notarized consent of the very man they had just kicked out into the street. Xavier spent 3 agonizing days trying to reach me. He called my cell phone dozens of times, leaving increasingly desperate, groveling voicemails. He emailed. He even tried calling Bradley's office, only to be hung up on by the receptionist. I had completely ghosted them, cutting off every single avenue of communication. The silence from my end drove them to the absolute brink of insanity. The impending $12,000 mortgage payment hung over their heads like a guillotine. If that deadline passed, the house would go into foreclosure, their credit would be annihilated, and they would be left with absolutely nothing. Late one night, sitting at the kitchen island surrounded by final closing documents, Megan presented a terrifyingly dark solution. She slid a printed electronic power of attorney form across the marble counter. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any moral compass. "Just sign it, Xavier," she whispered, her voice smooth and venomous. "It is an e-signature document. We just need to check the box, type his name, and route it through a cheap online notary service. He is an old man who does not even understand modern technology. He will never know." Xavier recoiled physically, pushing his chair back from the kitchen island. His face turned pale with sheer terror. "Are you completely insane?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "That is federal fraud. That is forgery. If we get caught, we will go to federal prison. I am not risking a felony charge because you want to save face." Megan did not flinch. She leaned closer, invading his personal space, weaponizing his deepest insecurities. "You are already a fraud, Xavier," she spat, her words laced with pure poison. "You built this entire life on your daddy's money. If this deal falls through, my parents will find out we are broke. We will be homeless. You will lose your startup, your reputation, and you will lose me. Do you really think your father is going to magically appear and save you this time? He abandoned us. He wants us to fail. If you sign this paper, we walk away with $400,000 in cash. We can pay off the debts, start over, and never have to deal with that arrogant old man again." She left the document resting on the marble, walking away to let the toxic seed of greed take root in his mind. Xavier sat alone in the dark for hours, staring at the digital form on his laptop. The fear of prison battled fiercely against his crushing terror of poverty and public humiliation. Ultimately, his overwhelming arrogance and blinding greed won. He convinced himself that I was too detached, too technologically illiterate to ever notice a digital transfer. With shaking, sweaty fingers, Xavier clicked the authorization box, typed my full legal name into the electronic signature field, and hit submit. He had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Miles away in the quiet, secure luxury of my penthouse office, my laptop screen lit up with an automated high-priority alert. As the managing director of Apex Holdings LLC, my legal team had implemented rigorous digital security protocols on every single asset in my portfolio. The moment Xavier submitted the fraudulent electronic power of attorney to the title company, a flagged notification was instantly routed directly to Bradley's secure server. Within 60 seconds, my phone rang. Bradley's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with a mixture of disbelief and predatory anticipation. "Martin," Bradley said, his tone razor-sharp, "your son actually did it. He just submitted a forged electronic release of lien and a fraudulent power of attorney to the escrow agent. The audacity is staggering." I stared at the digital copy of the forged document on my screen, looking at the fake digital signature that Xavier had so carelessly typed out. A heavy, profound sadness washed over me for a fleeting moment, quickly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. My own son was willing to commit a federal felony to steal from me. "Do we shut it down now?" Bradley asked, ready to dispatch the legal strike team. "Do we call the title company and freeze the transfer?" I took a slow, deep breath, watching the city traffic move silently far below my window. "No," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "If we stop it now, he will just claim it was a clerical error or a misunderstanding. He will try to wiggle his way out of it. Let them proceed. Let them submit the final forged documents to the state property registry. Let them sit at the closing table and believe they have won. We wait until the crime is completely legally irreversible." Bradley chuckled darkly on the other end of the line. "Understood, Martin. We let them walk right into the vault before we lock the door behind them." 4 days later, Xavier and Megan sat in the plush, leather-appointed conference room of an upscale downtown escrow agency. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows, casting a warm glow over the thick stack of final closing documents resting on the polished mahogany table. The cash buyers had already wired the funds, and the closing agent was cheerfully sliding paper after paper towards Xavier for his final signature. Megan was practically vibrating with arrogant ecstasy. She sat cross-legged, sipping complimentary sparkling water, completely radiating the aura of a wealthy socialite who had just successfully navigated a minor inconvenience. She leaned over to the closing agent, flashing a dazzling, entirely fake smile. "We are just so relieved to finally offload this property," Megan boasted loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear her. "We are liquidating some of our older assets to fund a massive new venture. We are actually looking at upgrading to a much larger estate closer to the country club. This $400,000 equity payout is just a nice little bonus for our weekend shopping budget." Xavier offered a tight, nervous smile, his hand trembling slightly as he signed the final deed transfer. He pushed the paper back to the agent, letting out a massive, shaky exhale. He genuinely believed he had gotten away with it. He believed the nightmare was over. The closing agent smiled brightly, gathering the signed documents into a neat stack. "Congratulations," she announced cheerfully. "The funds will be released to your account within the hour. You are officially closed." Before Megan could let out another squeal of victory, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed on the conference room door. The frosted glass door swung open forcefully. 2 uniformed county sheriff's deputies strode into the room, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. The cheerful atmosphere instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, icy dread. The lead deputy stepped forward, his eyes locking directly onto my son. "Xavier and Megan," the deputy stated, his voice booming with terrifying authority. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your backs. We have an emergency federal warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of wire fraud and felony document forgery." The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Xavier's wrists was a sound that would echo in his nightmares forever. The sheer humiliation of being paraded out of the upscale escrow agency in front of the horrified closing agent completely shattered his fragile ego. He spent 48 agonizing hours in a cold county jail cell before Megan managed to drain the very last of her personal savings, pawning her diamond engagement ring just to post his bail. When Xavier walked out of the detention center, he looked like a broken, terrified ghost. He was staring down the barrel of a federal felony conviction carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. The reality of federal prison was no longer a vague concept. It was a rapidly approaching train ready to obliterate their lives. Back at their sprawling, now heavily mortgaged suburban house, the absolute panic set in. Megan paced the hardwood floors like a trapped animal. Her carefully constructed socialite facade had completely evaporated. She realized that the only person on earth who could save her husband from a concrete cell was the very man she had callously tried to toss into a cheap nursing home. She needed me to withdraw the fraud complaint. She needed a miracle, and she was willing to play the dirtiest game possible to get it. Megan knew that groveling would never work on me. She knew that fake tears and empty apologies were entirely useless currencies against a man who had already seen her true ruthless nature. So she bypassed remorse entirely and went straight for extortion. She targeted the only vulnerability I had left in this world: my 5-year-old grandson, Leo. For 4 years, while Xavier and Megan were busy attending lavish galas and playing pretend millionaires, I was the one who actually raised that boy. I was the one who read him bedtime stories, taught him how to tie his shoes, and bandaged his scraped knees. Leo was the absolute light of my life, a pure, innocent soul, completely untainted by his parents' toxic greed. Megan weaponized that love without a single ounce of hesitation. She started by systematically severing all my access, She blocked my phone number from both her and Xavier's devices. She instructed Leo's prestigious private kindergarten, a school I had secretly been paying for, that I was no longer an authorized pickup contact. She effectively built a fortress around my grandson. Then, late on a Tuesday evening, a single text message pushed through from an unknown burner number. It lit up the screen of my phone as I sat quietly in my penthouse living room. The message was dripping with venom and desperate manipulation. It read, "Drop the federal charges immediately. Withdraw the fraud complaint and sign the house over to us. If you refuse, you will never see Leo again. I will move out of state, change his name, and make sure he forgets you ever existed. You have 24 hours to call your lawyer and fix this." She actually believed she had cornered me. She thought she could hold a 5-year-old boy hostage to shield her husband from the devastating legal consequences of his own criminal actions. She heavily underestimated the depths of my resolve. She thought the threat of losing my grandson would break my spirit, forcing me to surrender my assets and my dignity just to buy a few hours of visitation rights. I sat in the dim light of my office, staring at a framed photograph resting on my mahogany desk. It was a picture of Leo and me at the park from last summer. He was sitting on my shoulders, laughing with a bright, gap-toothed smile, his small hands clutching my forehead. Looking at his innocent face, a fierce, protective fire ignited in my chest. Megan and Xavier were not just terrible children. They were incredibly dangerous, morally bankrupt parents. They were actively teaching that boy that lying, stealing, and manipulation were acceptable tools for survival. If I caved to their blackmail, I would be validating their corruption. I would be abandoning my grandson to be raised by 2 convicted felons. I absolutely do not negotiate with terrorists. I picked up my phone and dialed Bradley. My lawyer answered immediately, sensing the shift in my demeanor. "Bradley?" I said, my voice cold and uncompromising. "Megan just threatened to completely cut off my access to Leo unless I drop the felony charges. She sent it in writing. I want you to unleash the full extent of our legal arsenal. We are not just defending my assets anymore. We are going on the offensive to protect my grandson. I want a filing on the judge's desk by tomorrow morning." Bradley let out a low, predatory hum of approval. "I have the documents ready, Martin. I will file the emergency petition at the stroke of 9. The next morning, Bradley marched into the county family courthouse and filed an aggressive, comprehensive petition for emergency grandparents' rights and temporary custody. We did not just ask for weekend visitation. We launched a massive legal strike aimed directly at their fitness as parents. Attached to the custody petition was a devastating mountain of certified evidence. We submitted the formal federal indictment for wire fraud and document forgery. We included the bank records showing Xavier's massive default and reckless financial instability. We attached the extremely threatening extortion text message Megan had sent from the burner phone, proving she was actively using a minor child as leverage to obstruct a federal criminal investigation. We painted a stark, legally undeniable picture of a highly toxic, unstable, and criminally dangerous household. The judge took one look at the federal charges and the blackmail evidence and immediately flagged the case for urgent intervention. When parents are facing federal prison sentences and openly threatening witnesses with child alienation, the state does not waste time. The family court instantly issued an emergency mandate for a comprehensive child welfare investigation. The wheels of justice were turning rapidly, and Megan had absolutely no idea that her blackmail attempt had just triggered a catastrophic avalanche. On Friday afternoon, a pristine black town car pulled into the driveway of Xavier's suburban home. Megan's wealthy, incredibly pretentious parents had finally arrived from Boston for their highly anticipated lavish 2-month stay. Megan rushed to the front door wearing her best designer dress, pasting on a desperate fake smile to hide the absolute nightmare her life had become. She opened the door to greet her parents, but standing right behind them on the front porch were 2 stern-looking agents from Child Protective Services flanked by a uniformed police officer. "We are here to conduct an emergency welfare check on your son Leo," the lead agent announced loudly. Megan's mother gasped, dropping her Louis Vuitton luggage right onto the concrete. The sheer weight of the federal indictment, the impending property foreclosure, and the sudden terrifying sight of Child Protective Services standing on the front porch next to his elite Boston in-laws finally broke Xavier. It was not merely a metaphorical break. It was a severe physical collapse. Right there on the manicured concrete driveway as Megan's mother dropped her designer luggage in absolute horror, Xavier clutched his chest, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He gasped violently for air, his knees buckling beneath him before he collapsed heavily onto the ground. The overwhelming suffocating stress of the financial ruin and the criminal charges had triggered a severe panic attack that quickly escalated into a stress-induced myocardial infarction, a mild heart attack. The police officer flanking the social workers immediately radioed for an emergency medical team. The chaotic scene of blaring ambulance sirens, flashing red lights, and panicked wealthy in-laws was the perfect poetic encapsulation of the fragile, superficial life Xavier had built. His entire world was being hauled away on a stretcher. I received a phone call from Megan later that evening. I expected to hear the frantic, tearful voice of a wife terrified for her husband lying in a hospital bed. Instead, her tone was icy, dripping with entitled venom and misdirected rage. She demanded I come to the private waiting room at the downtown cardiac care center immediately. I did not go to comfort my son. I knew exactly why I was being summoned. I walked into the pristine, softly lit waiting area accompanied by Bradley, my attorney. Megan was not sitting anxiously by Xavier's bedside holding his hand. She was waiting for me in the private lounge flanked by her parents, Thomas and Patricia. They were the absolute epitome of old Boston money dressed in understated but astronomically expensive designer clothes. They looked at me with unfiltered sheer disdain. They viewed me precisely as Megan had maliciously described me to them, a pathetic, mentally unstable, broke old man who was actively trying to ruin their daughter's perfect marriage out of pure ungrateful spite. Thomas stood up aggressively, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not offer his hand. He did not ask how I was holding up regarding my son's sudden hospitalization. Instead, he pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket, unscrewed a solid gold fountain pen, and scribbled a number with sharp, angry strokes. He tore the check from the binding and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between us. It was a check for $10,000. "Listen to me very carefully," Martin Thomas said, his voice laced with heavy, unbearable condescension. "We know you are struggling. We know you are lashing out because Xavier finally stopped handing you free handouts. You called those government agents. You filed those ridiculous, baseless custody papers. You caused my son-in-law to have a heart attack with your constant harassment. Take this money. It is more cash than you have probably seen in a decade. Take it. Drop the custody suit, drop whatever delusional fraud charges you think you have, and disappear from my daughter's life forever. Go find a quiet nursing home and leave them alone." Megan stood beside him, crossing her arms with a smug, victorious smirk. She genuinely believed her wealthy father had just swooped in to solve her entire catastrophic crisis with his checkbook. She thought my dignity had a price tag, and she assumed it was pitifully low. I looked down at the slip of paper resting on the glass table. I did not shout. I did not aggressively defend my financial status or explain the multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio I actually controlled. I simply reached out and picked up the check. I looked directly into Thomas's arrogant eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Megan. "You actually believe $10,000 can buy my silence," I said, my voice completely steady and razor-sharp. "You truly believe this pocket change excuses the fact that your daughter and her husband committed federal wire fraud. You think this covers the fact that they tried to extort me using my own 5-year-old grandson as a hostage?" I held the check up between both hands. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore it perfectly in half. Megan gasped, her smug smile vanishing, instantly replaced by wide-eyed shock. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again. I let the shredded pieces of their arrogant bribe flutter down onto the immaculate hospital floor like worthless confetti. Thomas turned violently red, the veins in his neck bulging as his chest puffed out in sheer indignation. "You arrogant, foolish old man," Thomas spat, his voice rising in furious disbelief. "You just threw away your only lifeline. You are going to die with absolutely nothing." I did not even blink. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper of my own. It was not a check. It was a formal, legally binding cancellation notice from a premium healthcare provider. "I do not need your lifeline." "Thomas," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that commanded the room. "But your son-in-law desperately needed his." I handed the paper directly to Megan. Her eyes darted frantically across the bold black text, her face draining of the last bit of color she had left. "Did Xavier ever tell you how he afforded that elite platinum-tier health insurance plan?" I asked her, my tone entirely devoid of mercy. Did he tell you it was a lucrative perk of his tech startup? It was not. It was a private commercial policy entirely funded by Apex Holdings, my company, the very company you maliciously tried to defraud. And I legally terminated that exact policy on the precise morning you ordered me to pack my bags and vacate the guest suite. I stepped closer to her parents, letting the brutal reality of their situation sink deeply into their arrogant minds. You should keep your $10,000, Thomas, I said. You are going to need it. Your son-in-law just received emergency cardiac care, a luxury ambulance ride, and a massive battery of specialized arterial tests completely uninsured. His hospital bill is already sitting at $60,000, and he has to pay every single cent out of his own empty pocket. I turned my back on their horrified pale faces and walked out of the hospital alongside Bradley, leaving them to drown in the absolute financial catastrophe they had created. With Xavier recovering from a stress-induced heart attack and a $60,000 medical bill looming over their heads, the illusion of their perfect suburban life was entirely pulverized. Megan and her wealthy Boston parents were backed into a suffocating, inescapable corner. Thomas and Patricia, desperate to shield their daughter from the crushing weight of federal fraud charges, public humiliation, and impending bankruptcy, decided to leverage the only weapon they had left. They could not buy my silence, but they believed they could buy a different kind of salvation with their remaining liquid capital. Megan, fueled by a toxic cocktail of panic and vindictiveness, sought out a man known in the darker, more corrupt corners of the city's elite circles. Dr. Aris was a high-profile, incredibly expensive psychiatrist with a notorious reputation for bending medical ethics for the right price. He catered exclusively to wealthy families who needed inconvenient relatives quietly institutionalized or declared legally unfit to manage their own trust funds. Megan walked into his lavish, mahogany-paneled office with a massive cashier's check funded entirely by her father. She did not ask for a genuine medical evaluation. She purchased a predetermined medically certified weapon designed to obliterate my legal autonomy and strip me of my voice. Dr. Aris went to work immediately drafting a completely fabricated, highly detailed psychological profile without ever speaking a single word to me or conducting a single cognitive test. He falsified a comprehensive medical history claiming that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia compounded by aggressive paranoid schizophrenia. He wrote that my recent financial decisions, including the eviction notices, the cancellation of the premium health insurance, and the formal allegations of wire fraud, were all textbook symptoms of a severe psychotic break. He meticulously documented that I was a profound danger to myself and my family, incapable of grasping reality or managing my own substantial assets. Armed with this fraudulent medical dossier, Megan and her highly paid legal team marched straight into the probate court. They filed an emergency petition for a permanent conservatorship. The strategy was as diabolical as it was desperate. If a judge declared me legally incompetent and stripped me of my civil rights, Megan and Xavier would be appointed as my permanent legal guardians. As my conservators, they would gain absolute unchecked control over my entire multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, my bank accounts, and my corporate entities. They would possess the absolute legal authority to instantly dismiss the federal wire fraud charges, withdraw the custody petition for my grandson Leo, and forcibly commit me to a locked psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life. They thought they had discovered the ultimate impenetrable loophole. They genuinely believed that by reducing me to a clinical diagnosis on a piece of paper, they could erase every single consequence of their criminal actions and seamlessly absorb my wealth. It was a terrifying, breathtakingly cruel scheme designed to bury me alive under a mountain of legal and medical bureaucracy. They filed the paperwork under the guise of an expedited emergency, hoping to catch me off guard and secure a temporary guardianship before I could even mount a proper defense. 2 days later, a process server knocked on the heavy steel doors of my penthouse, handing Bradley a thick stack of court summons. My lawyer walked into my study, his face uncharacteristically pale as he read through the aggressive, fabricated medical claims and the demand for emergency conservatorship. He anticipated that I would be furious, perhaps even frightened, by the sheer audacity of their attempt to strip me of my human rights. Instead, I leaned back in my leather chair, steepled my fingers, and let out a slow, genuine smile. Megan and Xavier had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of their entire miserable campaign. They only saw me as a retired, penny-pinching old man who occasionally dabbled in real estate. They never bothered to look into the philanthropic history of the city they lived in. Decades ago, when my wife was battling a prolonged complex illness, I had spent countless hours walking the halls of the city's primary hospital network. After her passing, I quietly established a massive anonymous endowment to fund advanced medical research and support the state medical ethics board. I had personally financed the construction of the new psychiatric research wing at the university hospital. Over the course of 30 years, I became the largest anonymous benefactor to the city's medical association. I did not just know the local doctors, I knew the chief of medicine. I knew the directors of the licensing boards. I knew exactly how fiercely they despised corrupt, unethical practitioners who weaponized their medical licenses for financial gain. Dr. Aris had absolutely no idea that the man he had just fraudulently diagnosed was the very man who funded the oversight committee responsible for investigating medical malpractice. Bradley looked at my smiling face and instantly understood. We were not going to mount a defensive legal strategy. We were going to arrange a public execution of Dr. Aris's career. The morning of the probate hearing was thick with heavy, palpable tension. The courtroom was hushed as Megan took the witness stand, fully prepared for the performance of a lifetime. She wore a conservative, understated gray dress, completely abandoning her usual flashy designer labels. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands, her eyes perfectly brimming with practiced crocodile tears. When her lawyer asked her to describe my mental state, she let out a flawless, trembling sob. "It has been absolutely devastating, Your Honor." Megan wept, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "Martin has always been like a father to me, but over the last year his mind has just deteriorated so rapidly. He wanders the house muttering about imaginary fortunes and fake real estate empires. He started accusing my husband, his own flesh and blood, of stealing from him. He became so aggressively paranoid that he canceled his own health insurance out of spite. We are terrified for his safety. We just want to get him into a secure, specialized facility where he can get the round-the-clock psychiatric care he so desperately needs before he hurts himself." She looked up at the judge with wide, innocent eyes, playing the role of the devoted, exhausted daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, Dr. Aris adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking incredibly smug and confident in the fabricated medical dossier resting in front of the judge. They thought the victory was already secured. The judge nodded sympathetically at Megan's tearful testimony before turning his gaze to the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, waiting for the respondent to present his defense. The doors swung open, but I did not walk in as a frail, confused old man shuffling to the defense table. I strode down the center aisle with impeccable posture, wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit that radiated absolute authority. But it was not just my commanding presence that sucked the air out of the room. I was not walking alone. Flanking me on my right was Bradley, holding a briefcase full of certified, flawless cognitive evaluations. Flanking me on my left was the chief of psychiatry from the state medical board, accompanied by the director of medical licensing. Dr. Aris looked up from his paperwork, his smug smile instantly vaporizing, as his eyes locked onto the supreme medical authorities who literally held the power to permanently revoke his medical license and send him to federal prison for medical fraud. Every single drop of blood drained from his face. The chief of psychiatry stepped forward, his expression harder than granite. He did not mince words. He presented the judge with a certified affidavit from the state medical board confirming that the psychological profile submitted to the court was a complete fabrication, utterly devoid of clinical merit or ethical practice. The judge turned a terrifying glare upon Dr. Aris. The disgraced psychiatrist stammered frantically, looking for an exit, but the damage was irreversible. The judge slammed his gavel, denying the conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice and ordering an immediate suspension of Dr. Aris's medical license pending a full federal investigation. Megan collapsed into her chair, unleashing a genuine, agonizing sob of total defeat as her parents watched the absolute destruction of their final legal shield. Xavier did not stay to comfort his weeping wife. He realized his last desperate avenue for acquiring my wealth had just evaporated in front of a packed courtroom. Out of options, out of time, and out of cash to pay his mounting legal defense fees, he slipped out the back doors of the courthouse. He ran to his car and drove wildly toward the downtown headquarters of his tech startup. He needed capital, and he needed it now. Xavier burst through the sleek frosted glass doors of his company headquarters like a raging bull. He completely bypassed the front security desk, ignoring the startled receptionist who called out his name. He marched directly down the main corridor and shoved open the heavy doors of the executive boardroom. Inside, Stephen, the chief executive officer Xavier had hired to manage daily operations, was sitting with 4 other senior board members reviewing quarterly projection reports. Xavier did not offer a greeting or an apology for the violent intrusion. He paced back and forth at the end of the long mahogany table, his face flushed with manic desperation and unearned entitlement. He slammed his palms down on the polished wood, demanding their absolute attention. He ordered Stephen to authorize an immediate emergency liquidation of a portion of his founder's shares or issue a massive, unprecedented executive bonus payout. He demanded a direct transfer of $500,000 to his personal bank account by the end of the business day. The board members exchanged quiet, uneasy glances, but Xavier interpreted their silence as insubordination. His voice escalated into an aggressive, arrogant shout. He reminded them that he was the visionary, the founder, the very reason any of them had a paycheck. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at Stephen, treating the seasoned executive like a disposable intern. He declared that he held 40% of the corporate equity and still considered himself the absolute boss of the entire operation. Xavier threatened to systematically fire every single board member sitting at that table, dissolve the development teams, and dismantle the software infrastructure if they refused his demands. He was entirely blinded by his own perceived authority, desperately clinging to the illusion of power he thought his ownership stake guaranteed. He paced the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, screaming that his personal financial crises were none of their business, but his financial demands were their ultimate priority. He demanded respect, loyalty, and an immediate injection of cash, fully expecting them to cower and comply. Stephen did not flinch. He did not cower, and he certainly did not reach for his computer to authorize a massive wire transfer. Instead, he calmly adjusted his tie, picked up a sleek leather binder, and looked at Xavier with a profound, icy pity. Stephen cleared his throat, letting Xavier's unhinged shouting hang in the air for a deeply uncomfortable moment. Stephen explained that the board had just concluded an emergency vote prior to Xavier's dramatic arrival. They were not authorizing any bonus payouts, nor were they approving any share liquidations. In fact, Stephen stated clearly, Xavier's access to all company accounts, internal servers, and corporate credit lines had been permanently revoked as of 9 o'clock that morning. Xavier let out a harsh, mocking laugh, claiming they had absolutely no legal authority to lock out a 40% shareholder. Stephen smoothly corrected him. He explained the precise legal structure of their initial series funding. The anonymous angel investor group, which held the controlling 60% majority stake and completely dictated the board's actions, had sent a formal binding directive at dawn. Stephen slid a thick legal document across the mahogany table. He pointed a steady finger at a specific, heavily reinforced paragraph in the founding corporate charter. It was the morality clause. Stephen explained that because Xavier was currently under an active federal indictment for wire fraud and felony document forgery, the clause had been triggered automatically. His 40% equity was entirely frozen by the majority shareholder. His voting rights were suspended indefinitely. He could not sell, transfer, or leverage a single cent of his supposed wealth. His financial paralysis was absolute and legally bulletproof. Xavier began to hyperventilate. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted across the bold legal text highlighting his complete ruin. He screamed that the action was entirely illegal, insisting that a phantom angel investor had absolutely no right to hijack his life's work based on unproven pending allegations. His voice cracked with sheer panic as he demanded to speak directly to the majority shareholder. He threatened to file a massive lawsuit against the anonymous investor, the board of directors, and the entire corporate entity for breach of fiduciary duty. He slammed his fist against the binder, demanding Stephen provide a direct phone line to the hidden billionaire who had been silently funding their operations for the past 3 years. Xavier promised to unleash a legal war, utterly convinced he could intimidate the unseen financial backer into backing down. Stephen remained perfectly composed, his face a mask of absolute professionalism. He slowly closed the leather binder and shifted his gaze toward the heavy frosted glass doors at the rear of the executive boardroom. He did not reach for a phone or a business card. "You do not need a phone number to speak with the majority shareholder," Stephen announced, his voice smooth and incredibly deliberate. "He contacted me this morning and requested to handle your termination in person." The heavy glass doors swung open silently. The entire board of directors instantly stood up in a synchronized show of profound respect. Xavier spun around, his face flushed with frantic rage, fully prepared to shout at the wealthy executive who had just frozen his last remaining assets. I walked into the boardroom. I was not wearing my usual casual suburban sweater. I was dressed in a pristine charcoal gray bespoke suit, a silk tie, and a pair of polished Oxfords. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who owned the very ground Xavier was standing on. Xavier's jaw dropped completely open. The blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His knees visibly buckled as his brain finally connected the catastrophic dots. I walked right past him without breaking eye contact, pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table, and sat down. I rested my hands on the mahogany surface and smiled. "You are fired from your own company, Xavier." Xavier dragged himself out of the corporate headquarters, a completely hollowed-out shell of a man. He drove back to the sprawling suburban mansion that was rapidly becoming his tomb. The moment he walked through the heavy front doors, the toxic atmosphere was suffocating. There were no comforting embraces or strategic planning sessions left. The absolute reality of federal prison combined with a bank account balance of absolute zero acted as a brutal pressure cooker on their marriage. The pristine united front they had carefully curated for their wealthy friends completely dissolved into vicious, ugly blame. Megan paced the kitchen like a cornered viper, screaming that Xavier was a pathetic failure who had ruined her life and embarrassed her family. Xavier screamed back, reminding her that she was the one who practically forced the digital pen into his hand to commit the forgery. The grand romance they loved to showcase on social media was dead, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct of self-preservation. When the ship finally starts sinking, the rats turn on each other to secure a spot on the last lifeboat. Megan realized Xavier was a sinking stone, and she had absolutely no intention of drowning with him. The very next morning, while Xavier was passed out on the living room sofa from a night of heavy drinking and sheer panic, Megan executed her own survival strategy. She shed her flashy designer labels, dressing in a conservative, understated pantsuit to project the image of a reasonable, victimized mother. She drove her leased luxury vehicle straight to the downtown financial district, parking discreetly in an underground garage. She took the private elevator up to Bradley's elite law firm. She did not have an appointment, but she caused such a frantic, tearful scene at the reception desk that Bradley eventually allowed her into his sprawling mahogany-paneled office. Megan sat in the plush leather guest chair, clutching her handbag, and immediately launched into a rehearsed, sickeningly sweet monologue. She leaned forward, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. She told Bradley that she had made a terrible mistake by trusting her husband. She claimed Xavier was an emotionally abusive tyrant who had completely orchestrated the fraudulent property sale without her genuine consent. Megan looked Bradley right in the eye and flatly stated that Xavier had forged my digital signature entirely on his own while she begged him to stop. It was a spectacular, shameless lie. She was offering to hand the prosecution the ultimate weapon. Megan proposed a formal, binding legal transaction. She promised to become a hostile star witness against Xavier in the federal wire fraud case. She guaranteed her testimony would ensure my son received the maximum mandatory prison sentence. In exchange for handing her husband over to the federal authorities, she presented her demands. She wanted absolute immunity from the fraud charges. She wanted full legal custody of Leo. She wanted the title to the suburban mansion transferred into her name, free and clear. And as a final stroke of sheer audacity, she demanded a monthly spousal support stipend of $10,000 directly from my estate to maintain her standard of living. She genuinely believed she was holding a winning hand, thinking we were desperate enough to buy her treacherous loyalty. Bradley sat perfectly still behind his massive desk, his face an impenetrable mask of professional indifference. He did not interrupt her. He let her speak, giving her enough rope to hang herself twice over. What Megan did not know was that the moment she sat down and began to bargain, Bradley had pressed a small, discreet button hidden beneath the edge of his desk. A high-definition digital audio recorder was capturing every single treacherous syllable escaping her lips. He watched her lay out her demands with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator analyzing its prey. When Megan finally finished her proposal, expecting him to eagerly slide a contract across the desk, Bradley simply folded his hands. He leaned forward and let out a short, dry chuckle that held absolutely no warmth. He told Megan that her offer was incredibly fascinating but thoroughly useless. Bradley explained that I had absolutely no interest in negotiating with domestic terrorists or granting immunity to greedy co-conspirators. He made it explicitly clear that my objective was not to simply punish Xavier while letting the architect of the forgery walk away with a multi-million-dollar house and a generous monthly allowance. Bradley stood up, towering over her, and coldly stated that Martin wants both of you to face the absolute maximum consequences of your joint criminal enterprise. The deal was unequivocally rejected. Megan's confident posture shattered instantly. The color drained from her face as she realized her ultimate trump card was utterly worthless. She grabbed her handbag and practically ran out of the law firm, terrified of what would happen next. Bradley did not just reject her offer and file the recording away in an evidence cabinet. He weaponized it. Later that same evening, the sprawling suburban mansion was consumed by a dark, oppressive silence. The electricity had not been cut off yet, but the house felt entirely dead. Xavier was sitting alone in the unlit living room, staring blankly at his laptop screen. He was desperately scrolling through his frozen bank accounts and reading the termination notices from his own startup, trying to find a single, microscopic loophole. At precisely 9 o'clock, his computer chimed with an incoming email notification. The message was sent from a highly encrypted anonymous routing address. There was no subject line and no text in the body of the email. There was only a single audio file attachment. Numb and curious, Xavier clicked download and pressed play. The pristine, high-fidelity audio filled the quiet, dark room. He heard the unmistakable, crystal-clear voice of his wife. He sat completely paralyzed as he listened to Megan, the woman he had committed a federal felony to please, casually trading his freedom for real estate and a monthly cash allowance. He heard her brand him an abusive tyrant and offer to be the star witness that would lock him in a federal penitentiary for a decade. A primal volcanic rage detonated inside Xavier. The ultimate betrayal completely snapped his fragile grip on sanity. He let out a raw, deafening roar of absolute fury that shook the walls of the mansion. He grabbed his heavy laptop and hurled it across the room, shattering the screen against the marble fireplace. Megan rushed to the top of the sweeping staircase, her eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing terror as she realized what he had just heard. Xavier charged up the stairs, screaming her name with a violently unhinged aggression. The terrifying sounds of heavy furniture being smashed to pieces and agonizing, horrified screams echoed violently through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Within minutes, alarmed neighbors were desperately dialing 911. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers illuminated the manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood, a stark contrast to the quiet wealth the street usually projected. Xavier was shoved out the front door, his hands firmly zip-tied behind his back by 2 unamused officers. He was sweating profusely, his designer shirt ripped at the collar from the explosive, violent altercation he had just unleashed on the house. Megan stood safely behind the threshold, crying genuine tears, this time, playing the traumatized victim to absolute perfection, while completely ignoring her own treacherous audio recording that had ignited his rage. Because the house was still technically his primary residence on paper, the severe domestic disturbance call mandated an immediate physical separation. The officers legally forced him off the property, and a judge slapped him with an emergency restraining order before sunrise. Stripped of his sprawling home, his startup, and his credit cards, Xavier found himself sitting on the edge of a stained mattress in a dilapidated, roach-infested motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzing outside his window blinked sporadically, casting a harsh, unforgiving red glow over the pathetic reality of his new life. He had plummeted from a multi-million-dollar mansion to a $30 a night concrete box in less than 24 hours. Desperation breeds severe delusion. Sitting in that squalid motel room surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the stench of stale cigarette smoke, Xavier absolutely refused to accept his crushing defeat. Instead of reflecting on the federal felonies he had committed or the absolute betrayal he had just suffered from his wife, he directed his venom entirely at me. He picked up his cracked smartphone and began a relentless, highly calculated smear campaign. He dialed every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family. He knew exactly how tight-knit our community was, and he weaponized that cultural loyalty without a shred of hesitation. When his Aunt Beatrice picked up the line, Xavier unleashed a masterful sobbing performance. He cried into the receiver, his voice cracking with fabricated trauma. He spun a horrific, intricate tale claiming that I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown and was aggressively using my hidden wealth to destroy his marriage out of sheer, unprovoked malice. He lied through his teeth, telling his cousins that I had bribed the police to frame him for federal fraud and that I had maliciously orchestrated the domestic violence incident to steal his startup. He painted me as a cold-blooded, tyrannical monster who had secretly hoarded millions while watching his own flesh and blood struggle to survive in a racist corporate world. He begged them for financial assistance, claiming his accounts were illegally frozen by a vindictive father who wanted to see him homeless and starving. The extended family, unaware of the actual facts and deeply moved by his theatrical sobbing, was completely outraged. My phone began to blow up once again. Angry voicemails piled up accusing me of abandoning my own son and destroying a young man's hard-earned success. They called me ruthless, arrogant, and severely out of touch with family loyalty. Xavier thought he was brilliant. He believed he was successfully rallying an army of sympathetic relatives to socially isolate me and force my hand. He assumed the court of public opinion would break me where his legal threats had failed. I did not waste my breath arguing over the phone with enraged relatives who were blinded by my son's manipulative tears. You do not extinguish a roaring forest fire with a watering can. You starve it of oxygen entirely. I instructed Bradley to reserve the entire private dining hall of the most exclusive high-end steakhouse in the city. I sent out formal embossed invitations to every single family member Xavier had contacted, requesting their immediate presence for a crucial family meeting. I paid for their flights, their premium hotel accommodations, and their transportation, ensuring there was absolutely no excuse for absence. When Saturday evening arrived, the opulent dining room was packed. Over 40 relatives sat around the long, candle-lit mahogany tables, murmuring in hostile, defensive whispers. They were fully prepared to confront me, armed with the toxic lies Xavier had fed them. I walked to the head of the room, wearing my sharpest tailored suit, projecting absolute, unshakable authority. I did not offer a defensive speech. I did not raise my voice or attempt to justify my actions to people who had never bothered to ask for my side of the story. I simply signaled the waitstaff. Instead of menus, the waiters placed a thick, bound legal dossier in front of every single seated family member. I stood silently at the front of the room and pressed a button on a remote. A massive projector screen descended from the ceiling. I played the high-definition audio of Megan trying to sell Xavier out to my lawyer, followed by a clear screenshot of the terrifying extortion text she had sent threatening to kidnap my grandson, Leo. I instructed them to open the dossiers sitting on their plates. Inside were the certified copies of the fraudulent mortgage documents bearing my forged digital signature, the staggering bank statements proving I had entirely funded Xavier's lavish lifestyle for the past 4 years, and the formal federal indictment for wire fraud. The final piece of paper in the binder was a printed transcript of the medical records proving the psychiatric evaluation was bought and paid for by Megan's family. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the grand dining room. The hostile whispers completely vanished, replaced by the loud rustling of paper and sharp, horrified gasps. Aunt Beatrice, who had left me the most aggressive voicemail just 2 days prior, covered her mouth with trembling hands as she read the extortion texts involving little Leo. The relatives looked at the undeniable certified proof of my son's absolute moral bankruptcy. The illusion of the successful, victimized young entrepreneur shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before their eyes. The deep-rooted honor and pride Xavier previously held in our community was entirely wiped out in a matter of minutes. They realized he had not only committed severe federal crimes against his own father, but he had actively manipulated their love, their cultural solidarity, and their loyalty to cover his tracks. The looks of anger directed at me transformed instantly into expressions of profound shame and deep, agonizing disappointment in the boy they had watched grow up. Unaware of the devastating presentation occurring at the upscale steakhouse, Xavier was pacing the stained carpet of his dingy motel room, growing increasingly desperate for cash to pay his mounting legal defense fees. He picked up his cracked phone and dialed Aunt Beatrice, fully expecting another round of sympathetic tears and a promised wire transfer to help him fight his supposedly tyrannical father. The line connected after 2 rings. Aunt Beatrice Xavier whined, his voice thick with fake vulnerability and practiced exhaustion. "I really need that loan we talked about. They are trying to lock me out of my own accounts again, and the lawyers want a retainer." There was a brief ice-cold pause on the other end of the line. The warmth she had offered him just days ago was entirely gone. "I have seen the files, Xavier." Her voice echoed, vibrating with absolute disgust and pure contempt. "Never call this number again, you scum." The call disconnected with a sharp, definitive click. While Xavier was rotting in his squalid motel room, stripped of his family and his dignity, a very different kind of crisis was unfolding back at the suburban mansion. Thomas and Patricia Megan's wealthy Boston parents finally grasped the catastrophic severity of the situation. The federal indictment for wire fraud and document forgery was not just a passing storm they could throw cash at, it was a hurricane that threatened to drag their precious daughter into a federal penitentiary. They realized that Megan's name was plastered all over the fraudulent financial documents, making her a massive criminal liability. Survival instincts kicked in immediately. They no longer cared about saving the marriage or maintaining their socialite facade. They needed to surgically amputate Xavier from their family tree before the federal prosecutors came knocking. Thomas flew in the most aggressive, ruthless, and exorbitantly expensive divorce attorney in the state. The objective was brutal and crystal clear: sever all legal ties to Xavier, secure full custody of Leo, and walk away with the lion's share of whatever assets remained. They filed the divorce papers under extreme duress, determined to throw my son entirely under the bus to save their own skin. The divorce mediation hearing was held in a sleek, neutral conference room downtown, a sterile environment meant to facilitate civilized negotiations. Xavier walked in looking like a hollow shell of his former arrogant self, wearing a wrinkled suit that smelled faintly of motel bleach and stale despair. He sat entirely alone on one side of the vast oak table, completely devoid of legal counsel because his funds were entirely frozen. On the opposite side sat Megan, flanked by her parents and her high-powered attorney, Richard Vance. Richard was an absolute shark in a tailored suit, known for completely destroying opposing parties in high-net-worth divorces. He wasted absolutely no time laying out their aggressive, uncompromising demands. He slammed a thick binder onto the table and launched into a fierce, calculated monologue. He painted Xavier as an abusive, criminally negligent fraud who had single-handedly destroyed the family's financial stability. Richard demanded that Megan retain sole ownership of the suburban mansion, full physical and legal custody of Leo, and a grossly inflated monthly spousal support stipend. Furthermore, he demanded a clean 50-50 split of all liquid corporate assets from the tech startup, conveniently ignoring the fact that those assets were currently locked down by a federal investigation and a strict morality clause. Richard pounded the table, insisting that Xavier walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the impending federal prison sentence he had brought upon himself. Megan sat quietly beside her attorney, gently dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the innocent, traumatized victim to absolute perfection. Thomas and Patricia glared at Xavier with pure, unfiltered contempt, entirely confident that their expensive lawyer was about to secure a total victory. They genuinely believed that by aggressively demanding half of the estate, they were securing a lucrative payout for their daughter, while simultaneously destroying the man who had deeply embarrassed them. They sat with perfect posture, whispering smugly to each other, already mentally spending the settlement money they believed they were owed for their daughter's suffering. They did not account for the fact that a divorce involving a distressed, deeply leveraged property required the presence of the primary lien holder to resolve the distribution of debt. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room swung open and Bradley walked in. He was not there to represent Xavier. He was there representing Apex Holdings, LLC, the primary creditor of the estate. Bradley took a seat at the far end of the table, perfectly composed, exuding an aura of absolute control. Richard paused his aggressive tirade, looking at my lawyer with a mixture of annoyance and deep confusion. Bradley did not raise his voice. He simply unclasped his premium leather briefcase and pulled out a single certified financial ledger. He slid crisp copies of the document across the long oak table directly to Richard, Megan, and her parents. "You are aggressively demanding an equal split of the marital estate," Bradley stated, his voice smooth and lethally calm. "Apex Holdings, LLC fully supports a strict 50-50 division of all joint marital assets and liabilities." Richard smirked, quickly reviewing the top sheet, assuming he was about to negotiate the transfer of a highly valuable property. But as his eyes scanned down the itemized columns, the smirk vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. Bradley laced his fingers together and delivered the crushing blow. "I am afraid there are no liquid assets to divide," Bradley explained. "Due to the punitive default interest rates triggered by the breach of the mortgage guarantor clause, the massive devaluation of the tech startup shares, and the mounting penalties from unauthorized credit expenditures, the current net value of this marital estate is not a positive number. The total joint marital equity currently stands at negative $200,000. The entire conference room was plunged into a suffocating dead silence. The court-appointed mediator carefully reviewed the certified documents provided by Bradley and solemnly nodded in absolute agreement. The law is entirely impartial when it comes to the equitable division of an estate. Since the massive debts were accrued during the course of the marriage and the credit cards and mortgage defaults were legally tied to both parties, the liability had to be shared equally. The mediator flatly informed Megan that securing a divorce and demanding a strict 50% split meant she was legally obligated to shoulder exactly $100,000 of the massive deficit. Megan gasped loudly, the color completely draining from her face. She looked frantically at her high-priced attorney, who was now staring silently at the undeniable financial proof, completely unable to argue against basic math. But the true catastrophic devastation landed squarely on Thomas and Patricia. The wealthy Boston parents suddenly realized the fatal error they had made years ago. When Xavier and Megan first applied for supplementary luxury credit lines to furnish their massive home, Megan lacked the requisite income history. Thomas and Patricia had arrogantly co-signed those financial guarantees. They were legally bound as secondary guarantors to the debt. If their daughter defaulted on her massive new obligation, the creditors would immediately seize the parents' assets to cover the remaining balance. Their arrogant decision to blindly support their daughter's superficial lifestyle had just trapped them in an inescapable legal cage. The sheer horror setting in on Thomas and Patricia's faces was an absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. They had marched into that mediation room wielding their expensive lawyer like a weapon, fully intending to financially obliterate my son and walk away with a fortune. Instead, they had just been handed an inescapable, legally binding invoice that shattered their superiority complex. From their arrogant position of demanding millions in assets and spousal support, the wealthy, pretentious in-laws were now legally on the hook. Through their daughter's shared liability and their own careless signatures, the mighty Boston socialites now owed my corporate entity exactly $100,000. The predators had just officially become the prey. The crushing reality of the divorce mediation was only the opening act of Megan's rapid, unforgiving descent. Exactly 48 hours after the mediator finalized the equitable division of their massive debt, the legal machinery of Apex Holdings, LLC, executed its final merciless maneuver. A team of county sheriffs, accompanied by the bank's foreclosure agents, arrived at the sprawling suburban mansion right at the break of dawn. The formal eviction notice, a bright neon orange document that signaled absolute financial death, was slapped directly onto the custom mahogany front door. Megan was given exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. She watched in absolute paralyzing horror as a contracted eviction crew systematically hauled her meticulously curated life out of the house. The hand-carved mahogany headboard she had bragged about, the imported Egyptian cotton sheets, and heavy boxes of her designer clothes were unceremoniously dumped onto the manicured front lawn. Neighbors she had once aggressively looked down upon now stood on their porches, whispering and pointing at the glorious, highly public collapse of the neighborhood's most arrogant resident. The heavy brass locks were changed and a thick iron chain was wrapped tightly around the front gates. The mansion was officially sealed, leaving Megan standing on the sidewalk with a pile of heavily leveraged junk and absolutely nowhere to go. Desperation quickly stripped away the very last remnants of Megan's socialite pride. Her first instinct was to frantically call her parents, fully expecting Thomas and Patricia to send a private car and whisk her away to the safety of their Boston estate. But the phone call she made from the curb of her foreclosed home delivered a completely different, horrifying reality. The crushing $100,000 liability they had unknowingly co-signed had triggered a massive panic within their own wealthy financial portfolio. Thomas and Patricia were now scrambling to liquidate their own assets to protect their retirement from the aggressive, unrelenting collection tactics of Apex Holdings. Her father's voice on the phone was completely devoid of its usual arrogant warmth. He coldly informed his daughter that her reckless, deceitful lifestyle had severely compromised their entire family. He told her she was entirely on her own to clean up the catastrophic mess she had created with her fraudulent husband. The line went dead, leaving Megan entirely isolated. She had no money, no home, no husband, and now no wealthy safety net to catch her steep fall. Utterly broken and out of options, Megan realized there was only one man left in the entire city with the power to reverse her annihilation. She spent her last $20 on a cab ride straight to the downtown financial district, marching into the grand lobby of the Monarch Tower. She aggressively bypassed the concierge, tailgating a wealthy resident into the private elevator that led straight up to my penthouse suite. When she began pounding on my heavy steel front door, I was already watching her frantic movements on the security cameras. I opened the door to find a woman completely unrecognizable from the pristine, arrogant daughter-in-law I once knew. Her designer clothes were heavily rumpled, her expensive makeup was severely smudged from hours of crying, and she looked absolutely pathetic. Without a shred of her former haughtiness, Megan collapsed right over the threshold. She fell to her knees on the cold, polished marble floor of my foyer, burying her face in her hands. She unleashed a torrential flood of agonizing, desperate sobs. The confident woman who had cruelly tossed cheap nursing home brochures at my dinner plate was now groveling at my feet, weeping so violently her entire body shook. She begged for forgiveness, claiming she had been blinded by Xavier's lies and forced into a corner by a failing marriage. She pleaded for a second chance, swearing she would do absolutely anything to make things right. When the pathetic, groveling apologies failed to elicit a single word of sympathy from me, Megan pivoted to the most manipulative, vile tactic she had left. She reached blindly into her purse and pulled out a framed photograph of my 5-year-old grandson, Leo. She thrust the picture up toward me, using her own innocent child as a desperate human shield to deflect my wrath. "Martin, please," she wailed, her voice cracking as she clutched the photograph to her chest. "Look at him. Look at your grandson. If you do not care about me, at least think about Leo. We are family. We are bound by blood. You cannot let the mother of your only grandchild sleep on the cold streets." She aggressively leveraged the innocence of a 5-year-old boy, attempting to weaponize my profound love for Leo to erase her own malicious crimes. She cried that Leo needed his mother to be financially stable, that he needed his childhood home, and that my financial retaliation was going to traumatize a completely innocent child. "You are punishing a little boy because you are angry at his parents," she screamed, her desperation twisting into a sickening, calculated guilt trip. "If you truly loved him, you would drop the massive debts, you would give us the house back, you would stop this completely vindictive rampage and be the loving grandfather he deserves. You cannot destroy us, Martin. It will break his heart to know his grandfather made his mother homeless." She leaned her head against the marble floor, sobbing loudly, entirely convinced that pulling the family card would finally break through my icy exterior. She thought my paternal instincts would override the sheer logic of my revenge. I did not flinch. I did not reach out to comfort her, and I certainly did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the absolute destruction of her superficial empire. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic display of a woman who had tried to legally strip me of my human rights and lock me in a psychiatric ward just days ago. I held a freshly brewed cup of premium dark roast coffee in my right hand. I raised the porcelain cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, bitter flavor wash over my tongue. I savored the absolute silence of my penthouse, completely undisturbed by her manufactured wailing. I looked at her kneeling on the cold, unforgiving marble floor, completely stripped of her power, her wealth, and her arrogant pride. She had shown me absolutely no mercy when she thought I was a broke, burdensome old man taking up space in her pristine guest suite. She had laughed while she plotted my total mental and financial annihilation. Now the scales were perfectly balanced. I lowered my coffee cup, my face a mask of absolute terrifying calm. I did not see a desperate mother. I saw a ruthless, calculating predator who had finally been caught in her own vicious trap. I stepped closer to her, my polished leather shoes stopping just inches from her trembling hands. I looked down into her tear-streaked, terrified eyes. "You seem to have a very selective memory, Megan," I said, my voice echoing with a lethal, icy precision. "You once sat at my dinner table, tossed cheap brochures at my plate, and told me I should go to a state-funded nursing home because my presence was a burden, and I was completely useless to your lifestyle." I took another slow sip of my coffee, maintaining unbreakable eye contact as the brutal reality of her situation finally crushed the last shred of her hope. "Now you are entirely useless to me. Get out." The torrential rain hammered relentlessly against the towering glass facade of the Monarch Tower. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a heavy, ominous sound that perfectly matched the destruction of the empire my son had so arrogantly tried to steal. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my penthouse, watching the violent storm wash over the city skyline. The concierge called from the front desk, his voice laced with professional hesitation. He informed me that a man claiming to be my son was standing outside the main entrance, refusing to leave the premises. I did not have to check the security feeds to know what Xavier looked like at this exact moment. He had been forcefully evicted, publicly humiliated by his own extended family, and legally cornered by a federal indictment. I took the private elevator down to the grand marble lobby. The polished sliding doors parted, and I saw him standing just beyond the heavy glass entrance, completely exposed to the relentless downpour. Xavier was soaked to the bone. His once immaculate designer suit was clinging to his shivering frame, ruined and stained with mud. The arrogant, untouchable tech executive who had demanded my immediate eviction a few weeks ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a pathetic, shivering shell of a man, stripped of his wealth, his marriage, and his pride. I instructed the security guard to unlock the heavy glass doors, stepping out under the wide, illuminated canopy that shielded the entrance from the torrential rain. The cold wind whipped across my face, but I stood perfectly still, buttoning my tailored coat. Xavier looked up, the rain streaming down his face, mixing seamlessly with his own desperate tears. The moment he made eye contact with me, his legs completely gave out. He collapsed onto the wet, unforgiving concrete of the driveway. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his ruined suit through the puddles, and desperately wrapped his arms around my legs. He buried his face against my knees, sobbing with a raw, agonizing intensity that echoed over the crashing thunder. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice cracking and pathetic. "I am so sorry I lost everything. Megan left me. The company locked me out. The federal prosecutors are going to send me to prison. Please, Dad, you have to help me. You are the only one left. I have absolutely nothing." He clung to me like a drowning man grasping at a life raft in the middle of a hurricane. He begged for a second chance, swearing that he would change, that he would work off his debts, that he would be the devoted, respectful son I had always wanted. He pleaded for me to use my legal team to squash the federal charges, to reinstate his startup shares, to just give him one final opportunity to rebuild the life he had so recklessly detonated. He cried that he was blinded by Megan's greed, that the pressure to maintain a wealthy facade had driven him to make terrible, unforgivable mistakes. He weaponized his own misery, hoping the sheer pathetic sight of his ruin would suddenly ignite my paternal mercy. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking violently in the freezing rain, waiting for me to bend down, place a comforting hand on his shoulder, and tell him that I would fix all his catastrophic mistakes. He was relying on the decades of unconditional support I had always provided, desperately hoping that my love for him was a weakness he could exploit one last time to save himself from a concrete prison cell. He promised to sign any contract, agree to any terms, and surrender any autonomy if I would just make the federal prosecutors and the crushing debt disappear. His promises were utterly hollow, the frantic bargaining of a man who only regretted getting caught, not the vicious crimes he had committed. I did not bend down. I did not place a comforting hand on his shivering shoulder, and I certainly did not feel a single drop of anger. Anger requires emotional investment, and Xavier had completely drained that account. I looked down at the top of his soaked head, my voice slicing through the noise of the storm with terrifying, absolute calm. "You are blaming Megan and the pressure of a wealthy lifestyle for your choices, Xavier." I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "But your choices were entirely your own. I did not raise you to be a victim of your own greed. I raised you with every advantage a father could possibly provide. When you were 18, I paid your exorbitant private university tuition in full in cash, so you would graduate without a single cent of student debt. When you wanted to marry Megan and buy a house you could not afford, I created a massive corporate shield and funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into your mortgage so you could play the role of a successful homeowner. When you wanted to build a tech startup and the banks laughed at your business plan, I became the anonymous angel investor who injected millions into your dream. I handed you the keys to a kingdom on a silver platter. I stood in the background, living in your guest suite, swallowing your daily disrespect just to watch you succeed. And how did you repay a lifetime of absolute, unwavering support? You sat at my dinner table and told me I was a financial burden. You ordered me to pack my bags and move into a state-funded nursing home so your wealthy in-laws could use my room. You forged my signature to steal my property. You actively plotted to strip me of my human rights and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to cover up your federal crimes. You did not just stab me in the back, Xavier. You looked me right in the eye while you twisted the blade. Xavier slowly lifted his head from my knees. His eyes were bloodshot, completely wide, with the horrifying realization that his manipulative tears were absolutely useless. The brutal, undeniable recitation of his own betrayals hung heavily in the freezing air between us. He realized that I was not the naive, generous father he could easily swindle anymore. He loosened his desperate grip on my legs, his hands sliding down to the wet concrete. He looked up at me, a broken, defeated man staring at the towering monument of the father he had so carelessly discarded. He wiped a mixture of rain and tears from his face, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. The sheer reality of his impending incarceration was finally breaking through his thick layer of lifelong entitlement. His voice was barely a whisper against the howling wind, completely stripped of its former corporate arrogance. "Are you going to just let me go to federal prison, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Are you really going to stand by and watch them lock your only son in a cell for years? I made a massive mistake. I was arrogant and stupid, but I am still your son. I am still the boy you raised. Please, Dad, I am begging you." He clasped his muddy hands together in front of his chest, staring at me with the ultimate desperate plea of a ruined man. "Will you ever forgive me for what I have done to you?" I looked down into his desperate, pleading eyes for a long, silent moment. The storm raged violently around us, washing away the last remaining threads of our toxic relationship. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored coat, stepping back to remove myself completely from his grasp. "Forgiveness is free, Xavier," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "I forgive you for your profound arrogance. I forgive you for your blinding greed. But in the currency of trust, you are completely bankrupt." I turned my back on him. I walked back through the heavy glass doors, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the penthouse, leaving my son kneeling alone in the freezing, relentless rain. 3 weeks after the torrential storm that washed away Xavier's last shred of dignity, we found ourselves sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the county family court. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating, a heavy silence punctuated only by the clicking of the bailiff's heels. The child welfare investigation, triggered entirely by Megan's reckless extortion text, had moved with terrifying speed. The family court system expedited the hearing due to the glaring reality of their impending federal criminal trials. Xavier and Megan sat at the respondents' table looking entirely broken. They were no longer the arrogant, perfectly manicured couple who had callously slid cheap nursing home brochures across my dining table. Xavier wore an ill-fitting, wrinkled suit, his face gaunt and shadowed from weeks of living in a squalid, roach-infested motel. Megan sat far away from him at the opposite end of the table, her posture slumped, completely devoid of her expensive designer armor. The presiding judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman with absolutely zero tolerance for domestic manipulation, meticulously reviewed the comprehensive dossier Bradley had submitted. She read the federal wire fraud indictments out loud for the court record. She noted the staggering negative net worth of their marital estate, the finalized foreclosure of their primary residence, and the deeply disturbing blackmail threats Megan had sent involving my grandson. The judge did not mince words. She looked down from the elevated bench and explicitly stated that neither parent currently possessed the financial stability, the moral compass, or the safe housing required to maintain custody of a 5-year-old child. Because Thomas and Patricia were currently drowning in their own massive debt liabilities triggered by the divorce mediation, they had officially withdrawn their names from emergency consideration. Xavier and Megan were entirely out of options. The state formally declared them unfit to parent. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed like a gunshot. The judge legally revoked their parental custody rights and officially granted full permanent physical and legal guardianship of Leo directly to me. A profound, agonizing silence blanketed the courtroom. Megan let out a choked, devastated sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. Her tears were finally genuine, born from the absolute crushing realization of her loss. Xavier stared blankly at the polished wood of his table, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. I remained perfectly composed. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked toward the gallery where my grandson had been waiting quietly with a court-appointed child advocate. Leo looked up at me with his wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the brutal legal bloodbath that had just concluded. I reached down and gently took his small hand in mine. He squeezed my fingers, offering a bright, trusting smile that instantly fortified my resolve. I was not just protecting my assets anymore. I was saving this boy from being molded into a replica of the two morally bankrupt felons sitting across the room. As I turned to lead Leo out of the courtroom, Megan abruptly stood up from her chair. She rushed toward the wooden partition, tears streaming down her pale, exhausted face. She reached her hand out desperately, calling Leo's name, begging for one last embrace. The court bailiff immediately stepped forward, placing a firm, unyielding hand on her shoulder to physically block her path. She was legally barred from unauthorized contact. Xavier slowly stood up next to her, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. They stood side by side, forced to endure the agonizing reality of their ultimate punishment. They watched helplessly as I guided their son toward the heavy double doors. They had aggressively plotted to throw me out of their house, treating me like a burdensome piece of trash to be discarded. Now they were legally stripped of their own child, forced to watch him walk away, holding the hand of the very man they had tried to destroy. I provided the impenetrable safety, the stable home, and the unconditional love that they had recklessly gambled away. We did not immediately leave the courthouse building. Bradley had reserved a private mediation room down the hall for one final mandatory administrative procedure. I instructed the child advocate to take Leo to the cafeteria for an ice cream cone, while Bradley summoned Xavier and Megan into the small, windowless room. They walked in, looking entirely defeated, dragging their feet, expecting me to deliver a final, vindictive lecture. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or gloat over their absolute ruin. I simply took a seat at the head of the conference table while Bradley retrieved a thick, heavily sealed legal binder from his premium leather briefcase. Bradley unclasped the binder and slid a certified, notarized document across the table. It was a formal declaration of a newly established, irrevocable financial trust. Xavier and Megan stared at the document, their eyes widening as they processed the bold, heavily inked numbers printed on the summary page. I had just liquidated a significant portion of my commercial real estate portfolio. I had transferred exactly $10 million in liquid capital directly into a blind trust fund explicitly bearing the legal name of my grandson, Leo. The sheer astronomical magnitude of the wealth resting on the table completely sucked the air out of the room. Megan gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Xavier stared at the 8-figure sum, his jaw completely unhinged. This was the legendary fortune they had suspected existed, the massive wealth they had committed federal felonies to steal sitting right in front of them in black and white. Before either of them could speak a single word, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. My voice was a lethal, uncompromising whisper. "Do not mistake this document for a lifeline," I stated, locking my cold gaze on Xavier. "This wealth is for my grandson to build his future, not for you to salvage your pathetic past." I instructed Bradley to outline the stipulations. My lawyer adjusted his glasses and read the ironclad, legally impenetrable conditions I had crafted. The trust was structured with absolute, ruthless precision. Xavier and Megan were legally barred from acting as trustees, co-signers, or secondary beneficiaries in any capacity whatsoever. They were permanently blocked from accessing, borrowing against, or interacting with a single cent of the $10 million. Furthermore, Leo would not receive immediate access to the funds when he turned 18. The trust was strictly locked until his 25th birthday, but the age requirement was only the first barrier. Bradley explained the ultimate non-negotiable clause. In order for the trust to disperse the funds, Leo had to present a valid certified bachelor's degree from an accredited 4-year university. He had to graduate entirely on his own merit, utilizing a separate, highly monitored educational fund that I would personally oversee. He had to prove he was capable of hard work, discipline, and academic dedication. If he failed to graduate, the entire $10 million fortune would automatically be donated to a designated list of medical charities. I was not going to hand a fortune to a young man who had not earned his place in the world. I was breaking the cycle of entitlement right here, right now. Xavier and Megan sat completely paralyzed in their uncomfortable chairs. The brutal, poetic justice of the situation was absolute. The incredible, life-altering wealth they had lusted after their entire lives was sitting right there on the table, printed on certified legal paper. It was enough money to clear their massive debts, dismiss their legal troubles, and secure the luxurious lifestyle they had desperately craved. But it was locked behind an impenetrable fortress of legal conditions. They had ruined their marriage, committed federal felonies, and lost custody of their only child trying to steal my fortune. Now that exact fortune was secured for their son, completely and permanently out of their reach. The wealth they wanted more than anything in the world was right in front of their eyes, but it would never ever belong to them. The federal courthouse was a chilling environment, a stark contrast to the luxurious boardrooms Xavier and Megan once frequented. Their sentencing hearing for the felony document forgery and wire fraud had finally arrived. They stood before the federal judge completely stripped of their arrogance, trembling as they awaited their fate. They had been terrified of spending the next decade behind bars. However, Bradley and I had made a highly calculated decision. I did not want to pay taxes to keep them housed and fed in a federal penitentiary. I wanted them out in the unforgiving real world facing the severe consequences of their poverty and ruined reputations every single day. We formally submitted a request for leniency regarding prison time, opting instead for maximum punitive restitution and probation. The judge, noting my unexpected mercy, agreed. He struck his gavel, sentencing both Xavier and Megan to 5 years of strict, heavily monitored probation. But the leniency ended there. The judge mandated an exorbitant financial restitution plan that would garnish any future wages they might manage to earn. More importantly, he sentenced them to 2,000 hours of court-mandated arduous community service, specifically directing the parole board to assign them to underfunded state facilities. They walked out of the courtroom free from a concrete cell, but they were now entirely imprisoned by their own ruined lives. The reality of court-mandated community service hit Megan like a physical blow. She had foolishly assumed her pristine upper-class background would secure her a comfortable assignment, perhaps organizing charity galas, or filing paperwork in a quiet, air-conditioned administrative office. Her severely overworked probation officer quickly shattered that delusion. He looked at her fraud conviction, noted her complete lack of marketable skills, and assigned her to the Department of Sanitation and Maintenance for the county public health sector. Megan was officially ordered to report for daily janitorial duty at a network of state-funded senior care facilities. The woman who once spent thousands of dollars on weekly manicures and custom silk dresses was handed a coarse, ill-fitting polyester uniform and a pair of heavy rubber gloves. Her new reality consisted of early morning bus rides to dilapidated buildings on the outskirts of the city. She spent 10 hours a day pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down sterile linoleum hallways smelling of bleach and decay. She was tasked with emptying bedpans, sanitizing communal dining halls, and changing soiled sheets for elderly residents who could not care for themselves. The physical toll was absolute and immediate. Her hands, once soft and adorned with diamonds, became cracked, blistered, and raw from the harsh industrial chemicals. Her back ached constantly from bending over porcelain fixtures. But the physical exhaustion paled in comparison to the agonizing psychological degradation. Every single day she was forced to serve the exact demographic she had so callously viewed as worthless burdens. The elderly residents did not care about her former socialite status or her wealthy Boston parents. To them, she was just another nameless, faceless cleaner meant to scrub the grime off their baseboards. She was constantly ordered around by stern, unforgiving nursing supervisors who had absolutely no patience for her tears or her complaints. If she missed a single shift or failed to complete her grueling quota, her probation officer would immediately revoke her freedom and send her straight to the county jail. She spent her lunch breaks sitting on an overturned plastic bucket in a damp supply closet, eating cheap sandwiches and crying over the absolute devastation of her glamorous life. The punishment was severe, highly targeted, and completely inescapable. The universe possesses a remarkable razor-sharp sense of poetic justice. 2 months into her grueling probation, Megan was transferred to a new facility to cover a staffing shortage. As she dragged her heavy cleaning cart up the cracked concrete ramp toward the main entrance, she paused to look at the faded, weather-beaten sign bolted to the brick wall. It read, "Shady Pines Assisted Living." A cold, paralyzing shock washed over her entirely. Her breath hitched in her throat as she recognized the logo. It was the exact same facility from the cheap, glossy brochures she had so aggressively tossed onto my dinner plate all those months ago. She had personally researched this specific underfunded state facility because it accepted the lowest tier of basic government pensions. She had maliciously selected it because she believed it was the absolute perfect dumping ground for a burdensome, useless father-in-law. She had tried to force me into this dreary, fluorescent-lit building to rot away in a cramped shared room just so she could turn my guest suite into a private yoga studio for her wealthy mother. Now the cruel irony of her situation wrapped around her throat like a vice. She was not dropping me off at the front door. She was walking through the employee entrance by the loading dock carrying a toilet brush and a bottle of industrial disinfectant. The very institution she had weaponized against my dignity was now the site of her daily, inescapable humiliation. She was legally bound to maintain the exact building she had deemed barely fit for my existence. The heavy, sterile air of the facility choked her as she realized the absolute, undeniable karma of her punishment. Every time she scrubbed a dirty floor tile in that building, she was forced to remember the arrogant, hateful decision that had ultimately destroyed her entire life. I had absolutely no hand in assigning her specific community service location. I did not need to manipulate the probation system to orchestrate her downfall. However, I did have a very old acquaintance, a retired mechanic named Arthur, who had recently been admitted to Shady Pines to recover from a minor hip surgery. I decided to pay him a visit on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, bringing a box of premium cigars and a few good stories to lift his spirits. I walked down the sterile, brightly lit corridor, my polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the cheap linoleum floor. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, projecting a quiet, undeniable authority that commanded respect from the nursing staff as I passed. As I approached the visitor lounge near Arthur's room, I heard the harsh, rhythmic sound of a stiff brush scrubbing against wet porcelain. I slowed my pace and glanced through the open door of the communal public restroom. Kneeling on the cold, wet tiles was a woman wearing a baggy, heavily stained gray uniform. Her hair was tied back in a messy, chaotic knot, and she was aggressively scrubbing the base of a heavily soiled toilet bowl. She paused to wipe a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her thick yellow rubber glove. She turned her head toward the hallway, and her exhausted, hollow eyes locked directly onto mine. It was Megan. The air between us completely froze. The heavy scrub brush slipped from her trembling raw fingers and clattered onto the wet floor. Her face drained of color as she stared up at me from her knees, surrounded by the harsh stench of bleach and human waste. She was entirely trapped in her supreme degradation, waiting for me to hurl an insult or gloat over her spectacular misery. I did not utter a single word. I did not need to. I simply looked down at her, tilted my head slightly, and let a small, effortless smile touch the corners of my mouth. I turned my back and continued walking down the hall, leaving her completely suffocated by the most ruthless, devastating psychological punishment imaginable. While Megan was scrubbing toilets to satisfy her community service requirements, Xavier was facing his own brutal, inescapable reality. The tech founder, who once wore tailored suits and barked arrogant orders in a glass boardroom, was now a convicted felon with a massive financial restitution mandate. His pristine, highly curated resume was completely toxic. No corporate entity in the country would hire a man federally indicted for wire fraud and document forgery, faced with the immediate terrifying threat of having his probation revoked for failing to make his court-ordered payments. Xavier had no choice but to seek employment at the absolute bottom of the economic ladder. He found himself standing in the sprawling, deafeningly loud loading bay of a massive regional logistics warehouse. The air was thick with choking diesel exhaust and the relentless, piercing beeps of heavy forklifts. He was hired as a basic freight loader, a physically demanding position that required zero background checks and paid just a fraction above minimum wage. His soft, manicured hands were immediately thrust into thick, coarse leather work gloves. The man who used to complain about the temperature of his morning espresso was now assigned to haul heavy pallets of industrial goods for 10 agonizing hours a day in a stifling, un-air-conditioned metal box. The physical toll of the warehouse shattered Xavier's fragile constitution within the very first week. Every single muscle in his back screamed in absolute agony as he endlessly lifted, stacked, and wrapped heavy cardboard boxes. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and completely soaking through his cheap, high-visibility safety vest. He had never engaged in a single day of actual grueling physical labor in his entire 36 years of life. I had shielded him from this kind of bone-deep exhaustion, paying his tuition and secretly funding his lifestyle so he could focus on his education and his dreams. He had repaid that paternal protection with utter disdain and federal crimes. Now the unforgiving concrete floor of the warehouse was providing the brutal education he had so arrogantly skipped. The psychological degradation, however, was far more agonizing for him than the physical pain. Xavier's direct supervisor was a harsh, no-nonsense 22-year-old shift manager named Kyle. Kyle did not care about Xavier's former tech startup, his fancy vocabulary, or his previously wealthy lifestyle. When Xavier failed to meet his aggressive loading quota or stopped to catch his breath, Kyle would publicly berate him over the warehouse loudspeaker. Xavier, who used to fire employees for merely disagreeing with his visionary ideas, was now forced to bow his head, swallow his immense pride, and apologize to a man 14 years his junior. He had to respectfully address his younger demanding managers as "sir" to ensure he kept the grueling job that was keeping him out of a federal prison cell. As he dragged a heavy pallet jack across the loading dock, aggressively wiping grime from his forehead, a profound realization finally pierced his thick skull. He thought about the decades I spent quietly building my real estate empire, the disciplined, relentless work ethic I had employed while he slept comfortably in a warm bed. He remembered mocking my simple clothes and calling my retirement pension a burden. He finally understood the sheer, undeniable value of a hard-earned dollar. Every single cent he now earned was soaked in his own sweat and humiliation, permanently stripped of the invisible financial safety net I had so generously provided. 3 months into his grueling new reality, the warehouse atmosphere shifted into a state of highly anxious preparation. The facility director announced over the intercom that the regional supply chain had just been acquired by a massive private corporate conglomerate. The new executive board was scheduled to conduct a comprehensive on-site inspection of the entire logistics hub. The floor managers frantically ordered the loaders to scrub the loading bays, align the pallets perfectly, and wear clean safety vests. They threatened immediate termination for anyone who spoke out of turn or slowed down the workflow. When the fleet of black-tinted luxury SUVs pulled up to the main loading dock, Xavier was busy wrapping a tall, unstable pallet of freight in thick industrial plastic. He paused, wiping the stinging sweat from his eyes, and watched the powerful executives step out of the vehicles. They wore immaculate bespoke suits and carried themselves with an aura of absolute unchecked authority. The facility director practically groveled as he greeted the lead investor, a tall man whose back was initially turned to Xavier. The group began their slow, methodical tour of the warehouse floor, intensely inspecting the machinery and reviewing the inventory logs with the shift managers. As the executive entourage moved down the central aisle, the loaders were strictly instructed to stand aside and maintain a respectful distance. Xavier stepped back, keeping his head lowered desperately, hoping to remain invisible in his stained, sweaty uniform. The group stopped just 10 feet away from his station. The facility director nervously pointed out a new sorting mechanism to the primary shareholder. The lead investor slowly turned his head to examine the machinery. Xavier's heart completely stopped. The air vanished entirely from his lungs. The powerful, impeccably dressed owner of the entire logistics conglomerate was not a faceless corporate entity. It was me. A cold, paralyzing terror gripped Xavier's entire body. His hands shook violently, causing the heavy roll of industrial plastic to slip from his raw fingers and hit the concrete floor with a loud, echoing thud. He was instantly convinced that I had orchestrated this entire corporate acquisition solely to stand in front of his managers and demand his immediate public termination. He braced himself for the ultimate crushing humiliation. He fully expected me to point him out, expose his felony record to the powerful executives, and have armed security physically drag him off the property. He stood entirely frozen, holding his breath, waiting for the final blow that would revoke his probation and send him straight back to a concrete jail cell. I turned my head at the sound of the dropping plastic. My eyes scanned the line of exhausted warehouse workers in their bright yellow vests and hard hats. My gaze locked directly onto Xavier. I saw the deep dark circles under his eyes, the thick industrial dirt smeared across his cheeks, and the absolute raw fear radiating from his trembling frame. He looked exactly like a cornered animal waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. I did not smile. I did not sneer. I did not point my finger or utter a single word of vindictive triumph. I looked at my son with the exact same mild, detached indifference I gave to the yellow forklift parked behind him. I simply broke eye contact, turned my attention back to the sweating facility director, and calmly asked a highly technical question about the quarterly shipping metrics. I walked right past his loading station without breaking my stride, continuing my inspection of my newly acquired empire. The realization that crashed down upon Xavier in that moment was far more devastating than being publicly fired. He understood with absolute clarity that he was completely insignificant to me. I did not need to fire him to destroy him. The most absolute ruthless punishment imaginable was letting him keep his grueling, back-breaking job. He would have to wake up every single day, put on his stained uniform, and break his back, moving heavy freight, knowing that every drop of sweat he shed was ultimately generating more wealth for the very father he had so arrogantly despised. He was permanently, inescapably trapped, living under my colossal shadow. 2 entire years have passed since the torrential storm that washed away the final remnants of my former life. I am now 71 years old, and the air up here at the very top of the Monarch Tower has never tasted sweeter. It is a brilliant, cloudless Tuesday morning. I am sitting in my custom-upholstered armchair on the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse, feeling the warm, golden sunlight bathe my face. The sprawling city skyline stretches out before me, a magnificent testament to the empire I quietly built and fiercely protected. In my right hand, I hold a steaming cup of dark roast Colombian coffee brewed to absolute perfection. There is no tension in my shoulders. There is no impending dread of a hostile dinner conversation. There are no deceitful whispers echoing down the hallway. The suffocating weight of being treated like an unwanted burden is entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable tranquility. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, complex flavors and the sheer, unadulterated silence of my own sanctuary. I am entirely free. Just inside the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, the source of my greatest joy is currently sprawled out on the plush living room rug. My grandson Leo is now 7 years old. He is a bright, endlessly curious, and incredibly compassionate little boy. Right now, he is deeply engrossed in constructing a massive, highly complex architectural structure out of wooden building blocks. He carefully places a wooden arch on top of his creation, his brow furrowed in intense concentration before looking up and flashing me that brilliant gap-toothed smile that instantly melts my heart. "Look at the tower," Grandpa Leo calls out, his voice filled with pure, unfiltered excitement. "It is even taller than ours." I smile warmly and nod, praising his architectural genius. Watching him grow in this environment of absolute peace and stability is the ultimate victory. When the courts granted me full custody, Leo was a quiet, anxious child visibly weighed down by the constant explosive screaming matches and toxic materialism of his parents' household. Today, he thrives. He is reading 2 grade levels ahead of his peers, he plays the piano with genuine enthusiasm, and he treats everyone he meets with profound respect. I have made it my ultimate mission to instill in him the exact values his parents so callously discarded. I teach him that wealth is a tool to be respected, not a weapon to be brandished. I teach him that hard work and integrity are the only true measures of a man's worth. He does not ask about the massive suburban mansion, and he does not ask about the flashy designer clothes his mother used to flaunt. He is perfectly content helping me tend to the rooftop garden, or listening to my stories about how I built my very first real estate business from nothing. I watch him carefully align a wooden bridge over his block tower, his eyes shining with pure creativity. We spend our weekends visiting interactive science museums, walking through expansive botanical gardens, and volunteering at the local animal shelter. He is learning empathy, kindness, and the profound importance of giving back to the community. He knows he is loved unconditionally, not for what he can provide, but simply for who he is. We have forged an unbreakable bond, a relationship built on absolute trust and mutual adoration. I saved him from a life of moral bankruptcy, and in return, he gave me the greatest gift a man could ever ask for. He gave me a genuine, loving family. The vicious cycle of toxic entitlement ends entirely with him. Sometimes when the evening light hits the glass table in my study just right, my mind drifts back to that infamous Sunday dinner. I vividly remember the exact texture of the cheap, glossy nursing home brochures Megan threw at my plate. I remember the cold, arrogant sneer on Xavier's face as he confidently told me I was a financial burden subsidizing my own existence. They were so incredibly certain of their supreme power. They genuinely believed that by reducing me to a homeless, penniless old man, they would finally achieve the elite social status they so desperately craved. They expected me to break down, to cry, to beg on my knees for a few more weeks in their pristine guest suite. Instead, I remember the immense, electrifying surge of clarity that washed over my entire being. I remember the heavy, satisfying weight of the canvas duffel bag on my shoulder as I walked out of their dining room. I remember tossing the heavy brass house keys onto the glass console table, the loud metallic clatter echoing like the final strike of a judge's gavel. I walked out of that heavy oak door into the cool night air entirely alone, completely severed from my own flesh and blood. But I was not broken. I walked down that manicured suburban driveway with my head held high, projecting a fierce, undeniable pride. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly the devastating arsenal I possessed. That single decisive moment of walking away was the catalyst for the absolute destruction of their deceitful empire and the glorious resurrection of my own life. The greatest, most pervasive lie society forces upon us is the concept of unconditional blood loyalty. We are conditioned to believe that sharing genetic material obligates us to endure endless disrespect, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse. But DNA does not forge a family. Blood does not automatically guarantee love. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine care for one another's well-being. Xavier and Megan shared my last name, but they behaved like ruthless parasites. They mistook my silent generosity for weakness and my quiet presence for incompetence. They believed my age made me disposable. I learned the hardest, most vital lesson a father can ever learn. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is surgical removal. When you discover that the people you love have become malignant tumors actively draining your resources and poisoning your peace, you cannot simply bandage the wound. You must cut them out completely without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. Only when you sever the infected ties can the healthy parts of your life finally begin to heal. Only when you eradicate the toxic elements can your own existence truly begin to bloom. They sat across from me at a polished dining table and coldly told me to either pack my bags or go straight to a state-funded nursing home. I did pack my bags. I walked right out the door. But the person who ultimately ended up in that exact same nursing home spending 10 hours a day on her knees scrubbing soiled toilets in a stained uniform was my arrogant daughter-in-law. And me, I am incredibly busy enjoying the absolute freest, most magnificent part of my entire life. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs the courage to stand up for their own worth. Tell me in the comments below how you have dealt with toxic relatives. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace. There is one final truth I want to leave you with today. It is a vital lesson about the dangerous mistake of confusing quiet patience with defenseless weakness. For 4 long years, I sat at that polished dining table listening to their boastful stories and absorbing their thinly veiled insults. They looked at my simple clothes and my silent demeanor, and they saw an easy target. They saw an old man who had outlived his usefulness and who was entirely dependent on their supposed charity. But true power never feels the need to announce itself loudly in a crowded room. Arrogance is almost always a desperate cover for deep insecurity and profound financial fragility. Xavier and Megan spent every waking moment trying to convince the world and themselves that they were untouchable elites. They drove luxury cars they did not own and slept in a sprawling mansion they absolutely could not afford. They were loud and demanding because their entire existence was completely hollow inside. I was quiet because I knew exactly the magnitude of the empire I held in my hands. I knew the foundation I stood on was built on solid rock, while theirs was built on rapidly shifting sand. When you spend your life generously giving your time and resources to others, they eventually stop seeing it as a privilege and start demanding it as a fundamental right. The very second you decide to set a firm boundary or close your wallet, you instantly become the villain in their fabricated narrative. But you must never let their toxic reaction make you doubt your own worth or regret your generosity. You must learn to carefully observe how people treat you when they firmly believe you have absolutely nothing left to offer them. When they think your pockets are empty and your influence is entirely gone, their true character steps out of the shadows. That is the exact moment you see the real person behind the polite smiles and the fake holiday greeting cards. Do not ever feel the need to aggressively defend your choices or prove your financial worth to people who are absolutely determined to misunderstand you and exploit you. Let them believe they have won the argument. Let them believe they hold the upper hand and that you are weak. Your greatest weapon is your ability to remain perfectly calm while they expose their own malicious intentions to the world. You do not need to shout to be heard, and you certainly do not need to seek loud, chaotic revenge. You simply need to remove your protective safety net and let the natural, devastating consequences of their own arrogant actions crash down upon them. Build your beautiful life in absolute silence. Protect your hard-earned resources with a ruthless boundary and never apologize for walking away from a table where respect is no longer being served. Your peace of mind is the most expensive asset you will ever own, so you must guard it fiercely. Please share this video with anyone who needs the strength to walk away from a toxic environment and subscribe to the channel for more stories of reclaimed freedom.